The desert air shimmered with heat above the streets of Fallujah. November 2004. The world's most dangerous city. A column of 4 M1A2 Abrams tanks rolled through the narrow streets, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Inside the lead tank, Captain Frank "Iron" Callahan scanned the rooftops through his commander's viewport, sweat trickling down his neck despite the climate control system. 30 years in armor had taught him to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. "Driver, slow down," he ordered, voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Something's off about that intersection ahead." The radio crackled. "Eagle 6, this is Eagle 3. Movement on the rooftops at your 2 o'clock. Callahan swiveled his periscope. There they were. Shadows moving too quickly, too purposefully. His mouth went dry. "All units, this is Eagle 6. Possible ambush ahead. Deploy smoke and prepare to—" The world exploded. The RPG struck the right side of Callahan's tank with a deafening boom that shook the 60-ton behemoth. Warning lights flashed across his console as the interior filled with acrid smoke. His driver screamed something unintelligible as a second explosion rocked the vehicle. Through the viewport, Callahan saw figures swarming from nearby buildings, firing AK-47s at the column. "Eagle 6 is hit! Eagle 6 is hit!" His gunner was shouting into the radio while returning fire with the tank's .50 caliber machine gun. Callahan tried to rotate the turret, but it wouldn't respond. The hydraulics were gone. Another RPG hit nearby, showering the tank with debris. Inside the steel coffin, the temperature was rising rapidly. "Engine fire, we need to bail." Callahan reached for the hatch above him, but it was jammed. The gunner was screaming now, trying to force his own hatch open. The loader lay motionless, blood streaming from a head wound. Outside, bullets pinged against the armor like deadly hail. The radio squawked to life. "Eagle 6, this is Recovery 1. Hold tight. We're coming for you." Through the smoke-filled viewport, Callahan saw it. An M88A2 recovery vehicle, massive and unstoppable, plowing through the debris-strewn street toward them. At its controls, Staff Sergeant Thomas Reed was a man on a mission, ignoring the bullets striking the vehicle's armor. The M88 ground to a halt beside the stricken tank. Reed emerged from the top hatch, firing his sidearm at the nearest insurgents, while his crew deployed the winch system with practiced efficiency. "Captain, can you get out?" Reed shouted over the cacophony of battle. "Negative! Hatches are jammed!" Callahan yelled back, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Reed nodded grimly, ducking as bullets whizzed past. "We'll pull you out of here. Hold on." The next 10 minutes were a blur of noise, heat, and fear. The M88's powerful winch system locked onto the damaged Abrams, and with a groan of metal, began to drag the 70-ton tank backward, away from the ambush site. An explosion rocked a building nearby as air support arrived, F-16s screaming overhead. Inside the tank, Callahan held his wounded loader, whispering reassurances even as he wondered if they'd make it out alive. The temperature was unbearable now, the smoke making each breath a struggle. The gunner had gone quiet, slumped against his station. Then, miraculously, they were moving, being dragged backward by Reed's recovery vehicle. After what seemed like an eternity, the firing grew distant. The tank lurched to a stop, and Callahan heard the sounds of tools against metal as Reed's team worked to force open the hatches. Sunlight suddenly streamed into the smoke-filled interior as the commander's hatch was wrenched open. Reed's soot-streaked face appeared above him. "Let's get you out of there, sir." Strong hands pulled Callahan from the tank. As he emerged into the blinding sunlight, pain shot through his right leg. Looking down, he saw blood soaking through his uniform. Shrapnel had torn through his flesh below the knee. The world began to fade around the edges as the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by waves of agony. The last thing Callahan saw before losing consciousness was Reed's determined face as the sergeant shouted for a medic. "Stay with me, Captain. You're going to make it home." 15 years later, Callahan woke with a start. The desert heat of Iraq replaced by the cool air conditioning of his quarters at Fort Irwin, California. The nightmare was always the same. The ambush, the fire, the faces of the men he'd lost that day. He sat up, rubbing his right leg where flesh and bone gave way to carbon fiber and titanium. The prosthetic was state-of-the-art, but on mornings like this, the phantom pain reminded him of everything the war had taken. Colonel Frank Callahan, now the senior armor officer overseeing training at the National Training Center, reached for his prosthetic. At 58, his hair had gone silver, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth telling the story of 3 wars and countless battles. Iraq had cost him part of his leg. Afghanistan had cost him his marriage. The Gulf War had taken friends he still mourned. But he was still here, still serving. While younger men commanded tanks in combat, Callahan made sure they were ready for what awaited them. The NTC was his domain now. 1,000 square miles of California desert transformed into the world's most realistic training ground for armored warfare. His phone buzzed with a text message. Staff meeting at 0800. The Pentagon visitors have arrived early. Callahan frowned. He'd been expecting visitors from Washington, but not until next week. Something had changed. In his experience, surprise visits from the Pentagon were never good news. 45 minutes later, freshly showered and dressed in his ACUs, Callahan entered the command center. The room fell silent as he walked in, the telltale sound of his prosthetic against the tile floor announcing his presence before he was visible. Gathered around the conference table were his senior staff and three unfamiliar faces in Army service uniforms, adorned with the stars and insignia of the Pentagon's top brass. "Colonel Callahan," said a silver-haired man with the 3 stars of a lieutenant general on his shoulders. "I'm General James Anderson, Director of the Army Futures Command. This is Colonel Wilson from DARPA and Dr. Elizabeth Harris, our Chief Robotics Engineer." Callahan nodded, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Welcome to Fort Irwin, General. I wasn't expecting you until next week." Anderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Plans change, Colonel, especially when the Secretary of Defense takes a personal interest in a project." "And what project would that be, sir?" Callahan asked, though he already sensed trouble brewing. Anderson nodded to Colonel Wilson, a trim man with steel-rimmed glasses who looked more like a professor than a soldier. "Project Iron Guardian," Wilson said, sliding a tablet across the table. "The future of armored recovery operations." Callahan picked up the tablet, studying the technical specifications and images on the screen. It showed a sleek, unmanned vehicle equipped with robotic arms and a sophisticated winch system. "You're proposing to replace the M88 with a robotic recovery vehicle," Callahan stated flatly. "Not proposing, Colonel," Anderson corrected. "The decision has already been made at the highest levels. We're here to oversee the final comparative trials before full implementation." Callahan felt his jaw tighten. "With all due respect, General, the M88 has been the backbone of our recovery operations for decades. My men rely on them. And men die operating them," Wilson interjected. "In hot zones, recovery vehicles are prime targets. The Iron Guardian removes human operators from danger entirely. It can be controlled remotely from up to 5 miles away." "Technology fails," Callahan countered, "especially in combat conditions. Dust, electronic warfare, mechanical breakdowns." "That's why we're here, Colonel," Anderson said smoothly, "to prove that the Iron Guardian is ready for field deployment. We'll be running comparative trials against your M88 teams over the next 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Callahan couldn't hide his surprise. "That's not nearly enough time for a proper evaluation." "It's all the time we have. The Defense Appropriations Committee votes on the next fiscal year's budget in 3 weeks. They need our recommendation before then." Callahan studied Anderson's face, seeing the determination there. This wasn't a genuine evaluation. It was a formality, a box to check before proceeding with a decision that had already been made. "And if my teams outperform your robots?" he asked. Anderson's smile was thin. "Then we'll take that into consideration, Colonel. But I should warn you that the Secretary himself is behind this initiative. The days of putting soldiers at risk for tasks that machines can do are coming to an end." After the meeting adjourned, Callahan stood alone at the window of the command center, watching as soldiers went about their daily routines across the base. For most of his career, he'd embraced technological advancement, better armor, improved targeting systems, enhanced communications. But this felt different. This felt like crossing a line. His phone buzzed again, a text from Command Sergeant Major Thomas Reed. "Heard about the visitors. Need to talk." 15 years after Iraq, Reed was still pulling Callahan out of difficult situations. Only now, as his senior non-commissioned officer at Fort Irwin, Reed's battleground was bureaucracy rather than Fallujah. Callahan texted back, "Recovery Bay, 1100 hours." The massive maintenance hangar that housed Fort Irwin's recovery vehicles was a cathedral of steel and diesel. The smell of engine oil and hydraulic fluid hung in the air as mechanics worked on the massive M88A2 Hercules recovery vehicles that were the workhorses of the Armor Support Battalion. At nearly 70 tons, 26 feet long, and capable of pulling an Abrams tank through almost any terrain, the M88A2 was a marvel of American engineering. More importantly, it was operated by soldiers who understood that recovering a disabled tank often meant the difference between life and death for its crew. Callahan found Reed beside the newest M88 in their fleet, inspecting the vehicle's A-frame boom with a critical eye. At 45, Reed was still built like the linebacker he'd been in high school, though his dark hair was now salted with gray at the temples. 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan had earned him a chest full of medals and the absolute loyalty of every soldier under his command. "They're really going through with it, aren't they?" Reed asked without preamble as Callahan approached. "Looks that way," Callahan confirmed. "General Anderson claims the decision's already made. We're just going through the motions with these trials." Reed ran a hand over the massive tow winch of the M88. "What's the timeline?" 2 weeks of comparative trials. Then they make their recommendation to the Appropriations Committee. 2 weeks? Reed shook his head in disbelief. That's barely enough time to demonstrate basic capabilities, let alone real-world scenarios. "My thoughts exactly," Callahan agreed. "This isn't about finding the best solution. It's about justifying a decision that's already been made." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You know Wilson?" "Not personally. Why?" "I served with Wilson in Iraq. Princeton graduate. Thought he knew everything about warfare from books and simulations. Never understood that war doesn't follow the textbooks." Callahan leaned against the treads of the M88. "This Wilson seems cut from the same cloth. More engineer than soldier." "And the general? Anderson?" "Career Pentagon. Hasn't seen actual combat since the Gulf War from what I can tell. But he's got the ear of the Secretary of Defense." Reed nodded slowly, processing this information. "So what's our play here, sir?" Callahan looked up at the massive recovery vehicle looming above them. "We do what we've always done, Tom. We show them what these machines can do in the hands of soldiers who know how to use them. And if that's not enough," Callahan's jaw tightened, "then I'll call in every favor I've earned in 30 years of service. I'm not letting them replace your teams with robots without a fight." Reed smiled for the first time. "Just like old times, then." "Just like old times," Callahan agreed. "Only with less shooting, hopefully." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young officer in crisp ACUs. Lieutenant Michael Reynolds was 25, fresh-faced despite his recent deployment to Syria, and carried himself with the confident bearing of a West Point graduate. "Colonel Callahan, Sergeant Major Reed," Reynolds said, saluting sharply. "I've been assigned as liaison to the Pentagon evaluation team for the duration of their visit." Callahan returned the salute. "At ease, Lieutenant. I wasn't aware they'd requested a liaison." "They didn't, sir. General Davis assigned me personally." Reynolds lowered his voice slightly. "He thought you might appreciate having someone from our team keeping an eye on things." Callahan nodded appreciatively. General Davis, the base commander, was an old friend who understood the value of human intuition in warfare. "What do we know about their test protocol?" Reed asked. Reynolds pulled a tablet from his cargo pocket. "They've outlined 3 phases: basic recovery operations, complex terrain challenges, and finally a full simulated combat scenario in the training area." "That's not nearly comprehensive enough," Reed said, frowning. "What about night operations? Extreme weather? Electronic warfare conditions?" "Not mentioned in the protocol, Sergeant Major." Reed exchanged a knowing look with Callahan. The test had been designed to showcase the robot's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. "Lieutenant," Callahan said carefully, "what's your background in recovery operations?" "Minimal practical experience, sir," Reynolds admitted. "I'm a tank commander by training, but my father served with the 16th Engineers in Desert Storm. He always said the recovery teams were the unsung heroes of armor operations." Something clicked in Callahan's memory. "Reynolds. Was your father Captain James Reynolds?" The young officer's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, sir. Did you know him?" Callahan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Captain James Reynolds had been his friend, his academy classmate. He'd been killed during a recovery operation in Iraq in 2005, trying to save a disabled tank under enemy fire. "I did," Callahan said quietly. "He was a good man, a damn good officer." Reynolds straightened imperceptibly. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you." Callahan made a mental note to have a longer conversation with the young lieutenant when time permitted. James Reynolds' son deserved to know the truth about his father's heroism. And perhaps there was poetic justice in having the son help fight for the very recovery teams his father had given his life supporting. "Lieutenant, I'd like you to show our visitors every courtesy," Callahan said. "But I also want detailed reports on their testing protocols, performance metrics, and any technical issues they encounter. Understood?" "Perfectly, sir." After Reynolds departed, Reed turned to Callahan. "You never told me you knew his father." "There are a lot of ghosts I don't talk about, Tom," Callahan replied quietly. "James Reynolds is one of them." Reed nodded, understanding the weight of unspoken history. What's our next move? We need to see this robot for ourselves. Then we prepare our teams for the evaluation. If they want to replace your people with machines, they'll have to prove those machines can do the job better. And I don't think they can. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the desert already shimmering by over 800 hours, as Callahan made his way to the demonstration area. A temporary pavilion had been erected on the edge of the training grounds, complete with tiered seating for observers and a sophisticated communications array. Beneath the pavilion, sheltered from the merciless sun, sat General Anderson and his team, along with senior officers from Fort Irwin. Colonel Wilson stood at a podium, tapping at a computer as a large screen behind him displayed technical specifications. Callahan took his seat beside Reed, noting the stiff postures of his recovery team leaders in the rows behind them. These men and women had spent years perfecting their craft, and now they were being told they might be obsolete. "Gentlemen, ladies," Wilson began, his voice carrying the polished cadence of an Ivy League education, "what you're about to witness represents the culmination of 8 years of research and development by DARPA and our partners in the private sector." The screen behind him changed to show a sleek vehicle approaching from the distance. As it drew closer, Callahan could see it was roughly the size of an M88, but with a lower profile and no visible crew compartment. Instead of the traditional A-frame boom, it featured multiple articulated robotic arms and a sophisticated winch system. "The XM300 Iron Guardian," Wilson announced with undisguised pride. "Fully autonomous or remotely operated, capable of recovering any vehicle in the Army inventory from any terrain imaginable." The machine rolled to a stop 30 yards from the pavilion. Its electric engines emitted only a soft whine, a stark contrast to the thunderous diesel roar of the M88. "The Iron Guardian combines the power of traditional recovery vehicles with cutting-edge artificial intelligence," Wilson continued. "It can analyze terrain, calculate optimal recovery angles, and execute operations with precision no human operator could match." From the corner of his eye, Callahan saw Reed's jaw tighten. "Furthermore," Wilson added, "the Iron Guardian can operate in environments lethal to human beings: chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear contamination, extreme temperatures, under direct enemy fire." "And when the enemy jams your signal," Reed asked, his voice cutting through the presentation, "or an EMP knocks out its electronics?" Wilson smiled thinly. "The Iron Guardian operates on a hardened, encrypted communication system resistant to jamming, and its circuitry is EMP shielded to military specifications." "There's no such thing as jam-proof comms," Reed countered. "Any system can be compromised." "Perhaps the systems you're familiar with, Sergeant Major," Wilson replied condescendingly. "But I assure you this represents a significant advancement over current technology." General Anderson stepped forward smoothly. "I think a demonstration would be more effective than debate. Colonel Wilson, please proceed." Wilson nodded and spoke into a headset microphone. "Control, initiate recovery scenario Alpha." The Iron Guardian sprang to life, moving with surprising agility for its size. In the distance, a disabled Abrams tank had been positioned at the bottom of a steep incline, partially buried in loose sand to simulate a vehicle trapped in difficult terrain. The robotic vehicle approached the tank, its sensors visibly scanning the situation. Its articulated arms extended, positioning heavy-duty cables with precision. Within minutes, it had secured multiple attachment points and began the recovery operation, powerful winches pulling the 70-ton tank free with methodical efficiency. "Impressive," Anderson said, nodding appreciatively. "Time to recovery was 40% faster than manual operations." Reed leaned close to Callahan. "In perfect conditions, with no opposition, no dust storm, and a pre-programmed scenario," he whispered. Callahan nodded almost imperceptibly. The demonstration was impressive, but also clearly choreographed to showcase the robot's strengths. "For our next demonstration," Wilson announced, "we'll simulate a more complex scenario: a tank disabled in an urban environment with limited access." The demonstration continued for another hour, the Iron Guardian performing a series of increasingly complex recovery operations with mechanical precision. Each time, Wilson would announce the percentage improvement over human operators, the reduced risk factors, the enhanced capabilities. Finally, Anderson stood. "I believe we've seen enough for today. Colonel Callahan, we'll begin comparative trials tomorrow at 0700. Please have your best recovery teams ready." As the crowd dispersed, Lieutenant Reynolds approached Callahan and Reed. "Your thoughts, Lieutenant?" Callahan asked quietly. Reynolds glanced over his shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. "It's impressive technology, sir. but they're only showing what it can do under ideal conditions. Exactly, Reed agreed. Notice how they avoided any scenario involving mud, deep water, or electronic interference. There's something else, Reynolds added hesitantly. During the presentation, I overheard Dr. Harris mention to one of her technicians that they had corrected the overheating issue from yesterday. Sounds like they're having thermal management problems they don't want us to know about. Callahan nodded thoughtfully. Good catch, Lieutenant. What else did you observe? The autonomous mode seems limited to basic maneuvers. For all the complex recoveries, they switched to remote operation. The AI isn't as advanced as they're claiming. Reed smiled grimly. Now we know their weaknesses. Let's make sure our teams are prepared to exploit them. That afternoon, Callahan called an emergency meeting with his recovery team leaders in the maintenance bay. 6 teams, each responsible for an M88A2, gathered around the hulking form of the newest recovery vehicle. By now, you've all seen what we're up against, Callahan began without preamble. The Pentagon has already decided to replace your teams with these Iron Guardian robots. These trials are just a formality to justify a decision that's already been made. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the group. However, Callahan continued, we have 2 weeks to prove them wrong, to show them what experienced recovery teams can do that no robot can match. Reed stepped forward and the Iron Guardian has advantages. It's faster in open terrain. Its winch systems are more powerful. It can operate in CBRN environments without protection. But it has weaknesses too. He ticked them off on his fingers. 1, it overheats under continuous operation. 2, its AI can't handle truly complex decision-making. 3, it relies on remote operation for anything beyond basic maneuvers. 4, it's untested in extreme weather, electronic warfare conditions, or against an actively opposing force. Our strategy is simple, Callahan said. Excel where the machine struggles. Show that human judgment, experience, and adaptability can't be replaced by algorithms and remote operators. Staff Sergeant Sarah Davis, the only female recovery team leader and a decorated veteran of Afghanistan, raised her hand. Sir, they'll design the trials to favor the robot. How do we counter that? By requesting modifications to the scenarios, Callahan replied. As the host facility, we have the right to ensure the trials reflect real-world conditions our teams face in combat. Lieutenant Reynolds will coordinate these requests through official channels. Davis nodded, a determined glint in her eye. At 34, she'd built a reputation as the best turbine engine specialist in the unit, able to diagnose problems other mechanics missed entirely. One more thing, Reed had added. Each team will be evaluated individually against the Iron Guardian. I want you to share information. If you discover a weakness, make sure the other teams know about it. We're not competing against each other here. We're fighting for our jobs and, more importantly, for the future safety of tank crews who will depend on these recovery operations in combat. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed specific strategies for the upcoming trials. Throughout the discussion, Callahan couldn't help but notice the fire in these soldiers' eyes. They weren't just fighting for their positions. They were defending their purpose, their identity as the guardians of their armored brethren. As the meeting wound down, Reed pulled Callahan aside. We need to talk about Reynolds, he said quietly. What about him? I've been doing some digging. His father and Wilson served together briefly before James Reynolds was killed. Callahan's eyes narrowed. And there was an investigation into Reynolds' death. Apparently, he requested recovery support from Wilson's unit when his tank was disabled. Support that never came. The implication hung in the air between them. Are you saying Wilson abandoned Reynolds in the field? Callahan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The investigation was inconclusive. Wilson claimed communications failure, but there were witnesses who said otherwise. Callahan felt cold anger settling in his chest. Does the lieutenant know? I don't think so. The investigation was classified, but if Wilson recognizes him as James Reynolds' son, keep an eye on the situation, Callahan ordered, and keep digging. If Wilson has a personal connection to this, I need to know. After Reed departed, Callahan remained in the maintenance bay staring up at the massive M88. His mind drifted back to that day in Fallujah, to the smoke and fire and fear. To Reed pulling him from the burning tank. Some debts could never be repaid. Some bonds never broken. He thought of James Reynolds, bleeding out in the Iraqi sand while waiting for recovery that never came. And of his son, now unwittingly entangled in a battle with the man who might have left his father to die. The stakes had just gotten much higher than the future of recovery vehicles. This was now about justice long delayed, about honor, about ensuring that the sacrifices of men like James Reynolds weren't forgotten in the Pentagon's rush toward automation. Callahan reached up and placed his hand on the cold steel of the M88's hull. "We won't let them forget," he promised quietly. The first day of trials dawned with an unexpected complication: a sandstorm approaching from the west. Meteorology predicted it would reach the training grounds by mid-afternoon. "We should postpone," Wilson argued in the morning briefing. "The conditions will interfere with optimal performance metrics." "Sandstorms are a reality of desert operations," Callahan countered. "Our teams train to operate in these conditions regularly." General Anderson studied the weather report thoughtfully. "The storm provides an opportunity to test performance under adverse conditions. We'll proceed as planned, but monitor the situation closely." Wilson's displeasure was evident, but he nodded stiffly. The first trial was straightforward: recover a disabled Abrams from open terrain with simulated mechanical failure. Each of the 6 M88 teams would perform the operation, followed by the Iron Guardian. Times would be compared, along with fuel consumption, damage to the recovered vehicle, and other metrics. Sergeant Davis's team was selected to go first. Her M88 thundered across the desert, dust billowing behind it as it approached the disabled tank. With practiced efficiency, her crew deployed, assessing the simulated damage, securing tow cables, and initiating the recovery. Davis herself directed the operation from the commander's position, her voice calm and assured over the radio as she guided her driver through the delicate process of extracting the 70-ton behemoth without causing further damage. In 27 minutes, they had the Abrams hooked up and moving toward the designated safe area. Not a record time, but solid performance under the watchful eyes of the evaluation team. 27 minutes, 14 seconds, announced the official timekeeper as Davis's M88 towed the tank into the recovery zone. Wilson made a note on his tablet, his expression revealing nothing. The next 4 teams performed similarly, with times ranging from 26 to 30 minutes. Reed's team, going last among the human operators, managed to shave the time down to 25 minutes flat, earning appreciative nods from the other recovery specialists. Then it was the Iron Guardian's turn. The robot moved with eerie silence across the same terrain, its sensors evaluating the disabled tank from multiple angles before moving into position. Its articulated arms deployed the recovery equipment with mechanical precision, attaching cables to the exact points specified in the technical manual. 19 minutes, 42 seconds, the timekeeper announced as the Iron Guardian completed its run. Wilson allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Nearly 30% faster than your best team, Colonel." Callahan remained impassive. "Speed isn't everything in recovery operations, Colonel. Let's see how it performs in the next scenario." The second trial involved recovering a tank that had thrown a track in difficult terrain, a steep slope covered in loose shale. This presented a more complex challenge, requiring careful winching to prevent the disabled vehicle from sliding downhill during recovery. Here, the human team's experience began to show. While the Iron Guardian approached the problem methodically, the M88 crews adapted their techniques to the specific challenges of the terrain, using their experience to anticipate and prevent problems before they occurred. Reed's team, in particular, demonstrated why human judgment remained invaluable. When the disabled tank began to slide during recovery, Reed immediately adjusted his approach, using the M88's blade to create a temporary berm that stabilized the tank while they completed the attachment of secondary cables. 28 minutes, 17 seconds, the timekeeper announced for Reed's team. The Iron Guardian, following its programming, attempted the recovery according to standard procedure. When the tank began to slide, its sensors detected the movement and paused the operation while its AI calculated a new approach. The delay cost precious minutes. 32 minutes, 5 seconds, came the announcement. Now it was Callahan's turn to smile slightly. "Adaptability matters, Colonel Wilson." Wilson's expression tightened. "A minor software adjustment will correct that issue. The AI learns from each operation." As the day progressed, the approaching sandstorm began to make itself felt. Wind speeds increased, visibility decreased, and fine sand worked its way into everything. The human recovery teams donned goggles and face coverings, continuing their operations with minimal disruption. The Iron Guardian, however, began to show signs of stress. Its optical sensors struggled in the deteriorating visibility, and sand infiltrated some of its more delicate articulation points. During its final run of the day, recovering a tank from simulated mine damage, one of its robotic arms seized completely. "We need to suspend operations," Dr. Harris announced, hurrying from the control station. The environmental conditions are causing system degradation. Reed exchanged a knowing glance with Callahan. This was exactly the kind of real-world limitation they'd expected to find. Anderson frowned at the stalled robot. How long will repairs take? We should have it operational by morning, Harris replied. But we'll need to enhance the environmental seals and clean the sensor arrays thoroughly. Very well, Anderson nodded. We'll resume testing tomorrow at 0800. As the evaluation team departed, Lieutenant Reynolds approached Callahan and Reed. Sir, I've been monitoring their communications. They're more concerned about the robot's performance than they're letting on. Apparently, this isn't the first time they've had issues with sand infiltration. Good intelligence, Lieutenant, Callahan acknowledged. What's your assessment so far? Reynolds considered the question carefully. The Iron Guardian is impressive technology, sir. In controlled conditions, it outperforms human teams in speed and precision, but it lacks the adaptability and judgment that comes with experience. And it's clearly vulnerable to environmental factors that your teams take in stride. Well analyzed, Reed nodded approvingly. The question is whether General Anderson will recognize those limitations or whether the Pentagon's investment in this technology has already blinded them to its shortcomings. That evening, Callahan found himself alone in his office, reviewing the day's performance metrics. The data told a story that the Pentagon might not want to hear. While the Iron Guardian excelled in optimal conditions, it faltered when faced with the unpredictable challenges that characterize real-world recovery operations. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. To his surprise, it was General Anderson. May I come in, Colonel? Of course, sir. Callahan rose, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Anderson settled into the seat with a sigh, looking older than he had that morning. I wanted to speak with you privately about today's trials. I'm listening, sir. The Iron Guardian's performance was not what I expected, Anderson admitted. The technical issues in the sandstorm were particularly concerning. Callahan nodded but remained silent, waiting. The truth is, Colonel, there's enormous pressure from above to move forward with this program. The Secretary has staked significant political capital on modernizing the Army through automation. The Iron Guardian is just one piece of a much larger initiative. I understand political realities, General, but my concern is for the soldiers whose lives depend on effective recovery operations. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. You don't think the Iron Guardian can do the job? I think it has potential, Callahan replied diplomatically, but it's not ready to replace human operators entirely. The technology needs more development, more testing under actual combat conditions. And if I told you that decision has already been made, that regardless of these trials, the Army will be proceeding with full implementation of the Iron Guardian program? Callahan felt his jaw tighten, but maintained his professional demeanor. Then I would respectfully suggest that decision risks the lives of tank crews who will depend on these vehicles in combat. Anderson studied him for a long moment. You've always been a straight shooter, Frank. It's why I requested you specifically for this evaluation, despite knowing you might be resistant to change. It's not change I resist, sir. It's unnecessary risk. Fair enough. Anderson stood, straightening his uniform. For what it's worth, I'll make sure your concerns are included in my report. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. The momentum behind this program is substantial. After Anderson departed, Callahan remained at his desk, turning over the conversation in his mind. The general's visit had confirmed his suspicions. The decision to replace the M88 teams was political, not tactical. No matter how well his teams performed, they were fighting an uphill battle against forces far beyond Fort Irwin. But Callahan had never been one to surrender, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. If they couldn't win through official channels, perhaps it was time to consider alternatives. He picked up his phone and dialed Reed's number. Tom, we need to change our strategy. Meet me at the recovery bay in 20 minutes. Whatever came next, Callahan knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon the men and women under his command without exhausting every possible option. Too many lives depended on getting this right. He thought again of that day in Fallujah, of Reed pulling him from the burning tank while bullets flew around them. Some things couldn't be replaced by machines, no matter how advanced. The courage, the judgment, the unwavering commitment to leave no one behind, these were human qualities that no algorithm could replicate. And Callahan was determined to prove it, whatever the cost. Later that night, Callahan and Reed stood in the shadow of an M88, the massive vehicle looming above them like a steel guardian. The maintenance bay was deserted at this hour, the only sounds the distant hum of generators and the occasional call of a night watch changing shifts. What we're considering could end both our careers, Reed said quietly, his face illuminated by the glow of a tablet displaying classified documents. I'm aware, Callahan replied, but if we're right about Wilson, about what happened to James Reynolds, we have a duty to bring it to light. Reed nodded slowly. The official report states communications failure as the reason Wilson's unit never responded to the recovery request. But I've found 3 witness statements that contradict that claim. Let me see. Reed handed over the tablet. Callahan scrolled through the documents, his expression hardening as he read the testimonies of soldiers who claimed Wilson had received the distress call but deemed the recovery operation too high risk, despite clear protocols requiring response. James Reynolds and his crew bled out waiting for help that never came, Callahan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. And Wilson got away with it. The investigation was shut down before it could reach any definitive conclusions, Reed added. Wilson had powerful connections even then. Callahan handed back the tablet, and now he wants to replace human recovery teams with machines he can control from a safe distance. No moral dilemmas, no difficult choices about risk. What's our next move? Callahan paced slowly alongside the M88's massive treads. We need irrefutable evidence, something that proves Wilson knew what he was doing when he abandoned James Reynolds. That was 15 years ago, sir. Any evidence that existed then is likely gone now. Maybe not, Callahan said thoughtfully. Wilson strikes me as the type who keeps records, who documents everything to protect himself. And he wouldn't expect anyone to connect him to a classified incident from the early days of the Iraq War. Reed considered this. Even if you're right, how do we access those records? They'd be highly protected, probably on secured Pentagon servers. Not necessarily, Callahan replied. Remember what Lieutenant Reynolds said about the Iron Guardian's communications? They're using a specialized encrypted system for the remote operations. The same type of system Wilson would have used in Iraq, Reed realized, following Callahan's thinking. And they've brought their entire operational setup here for the trials, including historical data for performance comparisons, Callahan nodded. We just need to find a way to access it. Reed frowned. That's beyond my technical expertise, sir. Mine too, Callahan admitted, but I know someone who might help. 20 minutes later, they were knocking on the door of Staff Sergeant Sarah Davis's quarters. Despite the late hour, Davis was fully alert when she answered, as if she'd been expecting them. Sir, Sergeant Major, she acknowledged, stepping aside to let them enter. I had a feeling I might be hearing from you tonight. Davis's quarters reflected her methodical nature. Technical manuals were neatly arranged on bookshelves. A workbench in the corner held partially disassembled electronic components. On the wall hung multiple certifications in advanced electronic systems and computer science, a rare combination for a recovery vehicle operator. We need your help, Sergeant, Callahan began. It's not strictly by the book. Davis smiled slightly. The best operations rarely are, sir. Reed explained their suspicions about Wilson and their need to access historical records from the Iron Guardian's communication systems. Davis listened intently, her expression revealing nothing. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. What you're asking is technically unauthorized access to classified systems, she said finally. That's a serious offense. It is, Callahan acknowledged. I won't order you to do this, and if you decline, there will be no repercussions. This is completely voluntary. Davis walked to her workbench, picking up what appeared to be a custom-built electronic device. My brother was a tank gunner in Iraq. His vehicle was disabled by an IED in 2006. The recovery team that pulled him out saved his life, got him to a medevac in time despite being under fire the whole way. She turned back to face them. If Wilson gets his way, there won't be soldiers making those split-second decisions anymore. Just machines following protocols, with operators sitting safely miles away. Is that a yes? Reed asked cautiously. Davis nodded. I'll need access to their command trailer, the one where they control the Iron Guardian during operations. Leave that to me, Callahan said. I'll arrange for an inspection tomorrow morning. Official business, checking compliance with base security protocols. I'll need at least 10 minutes alone with their systems, Davis warned. And what I'm planning won't be untraceable. They'll know someone was in their system eventually. By then, we'll either have what we need or we won't, Callahan replied. Be ready at 0700. As they left Davis's quarters, Reed gave Callahan a concerned look. We're crossing a line here, sir. I crossed that line 15 years ago in Fallujah, Tom, when I made a promise to myself that I'd never leave another soldier behind if I could help it. Callahan's voice was firm with resolve. James Reynolds deserved better. His son deserves the truth. And the soldiers who depend on recovery operations deserve more than political decisions made by men who've never felt the heat of a burning tank. Reed nodded slowly. I'm with you, sir, all the way. I never doubted it, Callahan replied. Get some rest. Tomorrow we fight back. Back in his quarters, Callahan couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, reviewing personnel files of the recovery teams, looking for every advantage they might press in the coming trials. The fate of the M88 program was likely predetermined by political forces beyond his control, but the truth about Wilson, something he could still fight for. He opened a drawer and removed a faded photograph. Himself and James Reynolds, standing proudly beside their tanks during Desert Storm, young officers with promising careers ahead of them. Only one of them had lived to see his hair turn gray. I owe you this much, James, Callahan whispered to the photograph, to make sure your son knows the truth, to make sure the system that failed you doesn't fail others. As dawn approached, Callahan finally dozed off, the photograph still in his hand, his dreams filled with the sounds of metal and fire and the faces of men he couldn't save. Morning came too quickly. Callahan was already showered and dressed when his alarm sounded, the phantom pain in his missing limb, a dull throb that matched his headache. He swallowed 2 painkillers with his black coffee, feeling every one of his 58 years. His phone buzzed with a text from Reed. Davis is ready. Wilson's team doing pre-trial checks at the command trailer. Perfect timing. Callahan grabbed his cover and headed out. The desert air still cool before the punishing heat of midday would arrive. As the senior officer overseeing the National Training Center, he had every right to inspect any facility on the base, especially one housing equipment for an official evaluation. The Iron Guardian's command center was housed in a large trailer at the edge of the demonstration area. As Callahan approached, he could see technicians bustling around the vehicle itself, making adjustments after yesterday's breakdown in the sandstorm. Davis was already there, dressed in her ACUs with a toolkit slung over her shoulder, waiting casually nearby. Colonel on deck, someone called as Callahan entered the command trailer. The technicians inside snapped to attention. At ease, Callahan said, looking around at the impressive array of equipment. Multiple large monitors displayed diagnostic information, camera feeds, and a 3D terrain map of the testing area. In the center, a sophisticated control station with dual joysticks resembled nothing so much as a high-end gaming setup. Dr. Harris, Callahan greeted the robotics engineer who approached him. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, just making sure you have everything you need. Not at all, Colonel, she replied, though her expression suggested otherwise. We're just completing final diagnostics before today's trials. Excellent. I brought Staff Sergeant Davis with me. Callahan gestured to the door where Davis now stood. She's our top electronics specialist. I thought she might be able to help if you're still having issues with those environmental seals. Harris looked surprised but nodded. That's thoughtful of you, Colonel. She's the best we have, Callahan said with genuine pride. I'll leave her with you while I check in with Colonel Wilson. Where might I find him? He's at the vehicle itself, supervising the hardware adjustments. Thank you. Callahan moved to leave, then paused. Oh, and Sergeant Davis will need access to your communication protocols to ensure compatibility with our base systems. Standard procedure for visiting equipment. Harris hesitated only briefly. Of course, Jensen, give the sergeant whatever access she needs. A young technician nodded, clearly not thrilled at being assigned babysitting duty. Callahan caught Davis's eye briefly before departing. The exchange invisible to anyone else. 10 minutes. Make them count. Outside, Callahan took his time walking to where Wilson was supervising work on the Iron Guardian, deliberately prolonging the conversation when he arrived, asking detailed questions about the vehicle's specifications, recovery capabilities, and operational parameters. Wilson, eager to showcase his creation, was more than happy to elaborate. 20 minutes later, Callahan's phone vibrated once in his pocket. The signal from Davis. She was done. Impressive machine, Colonel Wilson, Callahan said, wrapping up their conversation. I look forward to seeing how it performs today. When Callahan returned to the command trailer, Davis was showing one of the technicians a diagnostic tool of her own design. She looked up as Callahan entered. All done here, sir, she reported. Their systems are fully compatible with our base protocols. Excellent work, Sergeant. Let's let these folks get back to their preparations. They walked away from the trailer at a measured pace, not speaking until they were well out of earshot. Did you find anything? Callahan asked quietly. Davis's expression remained neutral, but there was a gleam in her eye. Oh, yes, sir. I found it. Wilson keeps incredibly detailed records of every operation he's ever overseen, including a certain recovery mission in Iraq, 2005. Callahan felt his heart rate increase, and he received Captain Reynolds' distress call, logged it, acknowledged it, then deliberately classified the situation as non-viable recovery, despite 3 separate assessments from his team stating the opposite. "You have proof?" Davis patted her pocket. Copied to a secure drive, timestamped communication logs, Wilson's personal notes, even his after-action report where he fabricated the communications failure story. Callahan took a deep breath. This was it. The evidence they needed to expose Wilson's lie, and perhaps more importantly, to give Lieutenant Reynolds closure about his father's death. "What now, sir?" Davis asked. "Now," Callahan said, his voice hardening with resolve, "we continue with the trials. We show them what our teams can do. And when the moment is right, we use what you've found." Davis nodded. "One more thing, sir. While I was in their system, I found something else. Performance data on the Iron Guardian. Their own testing shows catastrophic failure rates under combat conditions. They've been manipulating the data for the Pentagon briefings." "Why am I not surprised?" Callahan muttered. "Good work, Sergeant. Really good work. Now get your team ready for today's trials." As Davis headed off to prepare her M88 crew, Callahan pulled out his phone and texted Reed, "We've got it. Meet me at my office in an hour." The evidence against Wilson was even more damning than Callahan had hoped. Not only had he abandoned James Reynolds and his crew, but he was now deliberately concealing safety concerns about the Iron Guardian to push through its adoption. But Callahan knew they needed to be strategic about how they used this information. Revealing it too soon might jeopardize the trials and give Wilson time to prepare a defense. Better to wait until the human teams had proven their superiority than deliver the final blow. For now, they would continue the dance, show the Pentagon what experienced recovery teams could do, highlight the Iron Guardian's limitations, and when the moment was right, they would ensure that justice, long delayed, would finally be served. Callahan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as he walked through the bustling base. For 15 years, he'd carried the guilt of surviving when others hadn't, of being pulled from that burning tank in Fallujah while men like James Reynolds were left to die in similar circumstances. Now, perhaps, he could finally make it right. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, promising another scorching day. But Callahan welcomed the heat. After all, fire was where the strongest steel was forged. About honor, about ensuring that the sacrifices of men like James Reynolds weren't forgotten in the Pentagon's rush toward automation. Callahan reached up and placed his hand on the cold steel of the M88's hull. "We won't let them forget," he promised quietly. The first day of trials dawned with an unexpected complication, a sandstorm approaching from the west. Meteorology predicted it would reach the training grounds by mid-afternoon. "We should postpone," Wilson argued in the morning briefing. "The conditions will interfere with optimal performance metrics." "Sandstorms are a reality of desert operations," Callahan countered. "Our teams trained to operate in these conditions regularly." General Anderson studied the weather report thoughtfully. "The storm provides an opportunity to test performance under adverse conditions. We'll proceed as planned, but monitor the situation closely." Wilson's displeasure was evident, but he nodded stiffly. The first trial was straightforward. Recover a disabled Abrams from open terrain with simulated mechanical failure. Each of the 6 M88 teams would perform the operation, followed by the Iron Guardian. Times would be compared, along with fuel consumption, damage to the recovered vehicle, and other metrics. Sergeant Davis's team was selected to go first. Her M88 thundered across the desert, dust billowing behind it as it approached the disabled tank. With practiced efficiency, her crew deployed, assessing the simulated damage, securing tow cables, and initiating the recovery. Davis herself directed the operation from the commander's position, her voice calm and assured over the radio as she guided her driver through the delicate process of extracting the 70-ton behemoth without causing further damage. In 27 minutes, they had the Abrams hooked up and moving toward the designated safe area. Not a record time, but solid performance under the watchful eyes of the evaluation team. 27 minutes, 14 seconds, announced the official timekeeper as Davis's M88 towed the tank into the recovery zone. Wilson made a note on his tablet, his expression revealing nothing. The next 4 teams performed similarly, with times ranging from 26 to 30 minutes. Reed's team, going last among the human operators, managed to shave the time down to 25 minutes flat, earning appreciative nods from the other recovery specialists. Then it was the Iron Guardian's turn. The robot moved with eerie silence across the same terrain, its sensors evaluating the disabled tank from multiple angles before moving into position. Its articulated arms deployed the recovery equipment with mechanical precision, attaching cables to the exact points specified in the technical manual. 19 minutes, 42 seconds, the timekeeper announced as the Iron Guardian completed its run. Wilson allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Nearly 30% faster than your best team, Colonel. Callahan remained impassive. Speed isn't everything in recovery operations, Colonel. Let's see how it performs in the next scenario. The second trial involved recovering a tank that had thrown a track in difficult terrain, a steep slope covered in loose shale. This presented a more complex challenge, requiring careful winching to prevent the disabled vehicle from sliding downhill during recovery. Here, the human team's experience began to show. While the Iron Guardian approached the problem methodically, the M88 crews adapted their techniques to the specific challenges of the terrain, using their experience to anticipate and prevent problems before they occurred. Reed's team, in particular, demonstrated why human judgment remained invaluable. When the disabled tank began to slide during recovery, Reed immediately adjusted his approach, using the M88's blade to create a temporary berm that stabilized the tank while they completed the attachment of secondary cables. 28 minutes, 17 seconds, the timekeeper announced for Reed's team. The Iron Guardian, following its programming, attempted the recovery according to standard procedure. When the tank began to slide, its sensors detected the movement and paused the operation while its AI calculated a new approach. The delay cost precious minutes. 32 minutes, 5 seconds, came the announcement. Now it was Callahan's turn to smile slightly. Adaptability matters, Colonel Wilson. Wilson's expression tightened. A minor software adjustment will correct that issue. The AI learns from each operation. As the day progressed, the approaching sandstorm began to make itself felt. Wind speeds increased, visibility decreased, and fine sand worked its way into everything. The human recovery teams donned goggles and face coverings, continuing their operations with minimal disruption. The Iron Guardian, however, began to show signs of stress. Its optical sensors struggled in the deteriorating visibility, and sand infiltrated some of its more delicate articulation points. During its final run of the day, recovering a tank from simulated mine damage, one of its robotic arms seized completely. "We need to suspend operations," Dr. Harris announced, hurrying from the control station. "The environmental conditions are causing system degradation." Reed exchanged a knowing glance with Callahan. This was exactly the kind of real-world limitation they'd expected to find. Anderson frowned at the stalled robot. "How long will repairs take?" "We should have it operational by morning," Harris replied, "but we'll need to enhance the environmental seals and clean the sensor arrays thoroughly." "Very well," Anderson nodded. "We'll resume testing tomorrow at 0800. As the evaluation team departed, Lieutenant Reynolds approached Callahan and Reed. "Sir, I've been monitoring their communications. They're more concerned about the robot's performance than they're letting on. Apparently, this isn't the first time they've had issues with sand infiltration." "Good intelligence, Lieutenant," Callahan acknowledged. "What's your assessment so far?" Reynolds considered the question carefully. "The Iron Guardian is impressive technology, sir. In controlled conditions, it outperforms human teams in speed and precision, but it lacks the adaptability and judgment that comes with experience, and it's clearly vulnerable to environmental factors that your teams take in stride." "Well analyzed," Reed nodded approvingly. "The question is whether General Anderson will recognize those limitations, or whether the Pentagon's investment in this technology has already blinded them to its shortcomings." That evening, Callahan found himself alone in his office, reviewing the day's performance metrics. The data told a story that the Pentagon might not want to hear. While the Iron Guardian excelled in optimal conditions, it faltered when faced with the unpredictable challenges that characterized real-world recovery operations. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. To his surprise, it was General Anderson. "May I come in, Colonel?" "Of course, sir." Callahan rose, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Anderson settled into the seat with a sigh, looking older than he had that morning. "I wanted to speak with you privately about today's trials." "I'm listening, sir." "The Iron Guardian's performance was not what I expected," Anderson admitted. "The technical issues in the sandstorm were particularly concerning." Callahan nodded but remained silent, waiting. "The truth is, Colonel, there's enormous pressure from above to move forward with this program. The Secretary has staked significant political capital on modernizing the Army through automation. The Iron Guardian is just one piece of a much larger initiative. I understand political realities, General, but my concern is for the soldiers whose lives depend on effective recovery operations. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. You don't think the Iron Guardian can do the job? I think it has potential, Callahan replied diplomatically, but it's not ready to replace human operators entirely. The technology needs more development, more testing under actual combat conditions. And if I told you that decision has already been made, that regardless of these trials, the Army will be proceeding with full implementation of the Iron Guardian program, Callahan felt his jaw tighten, but maintained his professional demeanor. Then I would respectfully suggest that decision risks the lives of tank crews who will depend on these vehicles in combat. Anderson studied him for a long moment. You've always been a straight shooter, Frank. It's why I requested you specifically for this evaluation, despite knowing you might be resistant to change. It's not change I resist, sir. It's unnecessary risk. Fair enough. Anderson stood, straightening his uniform. For what it's worth, I'll make sure your concerns are included in my report. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. The momentum behind this program is substantial. After Anderson departed, Callahan remained at his desk, turning over the conversation in his mind. The general's visit had confirmed his suspicions. The decision to replace the M88 teams was political, not tactical. No matter how well his teams performed, they were fighting an uphill battle against forces far beyond Fort Irwin. But Callahan had never been one to surrender, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. If they couldn't win through official channels, perhaps it was time to consider alternatives. He picked up his phone and dialed Reed's number. Tom, we need to change our strategy. Meet me at the recovery bay in 20 minutes. Whatever came next, Callahan knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't abandon the men and women under his command without exhausting every possible option. Too many lives depended on getting this right. He thought again of that day in Fallujah, of Reed pulling him from the burning tank while bullets flew around them. Some things couldn't be replaced by machines, no matter how advanced. The courage, the judgment, the unwavering commitment to leave no one behind, these were human qualities that no algorithm could replicate. And Callahan was determined to prove it, whatever the cost. The second day of trials began under a merciless sun, the desert heat already climbing past 90 degrees by Euro 800 hours. Callahan stood with Reed at the edge of the testing grounds, watching as technicians made final adjustments to the Iron Guardian. After yesterday's breakdown in the sandstorm, Wilson's team had worked through the night to clean and reseal the robot's sensitive components. They've added extra shielding around the sensor arrays, Reed observed, studying the vehicle through binoculars. Looks like they're taking the environmental challenges more seriously now. Callahan nodded. Let's see if it helps. Today's scenarios will push both man and machine to their limits. The day's first test was designated Complex Terrain Extraction, a disabled tank positioned in a narrow ravine with unstable rock formations on both sides. Recovery teams would need to navigate treacherous ground, stabilize the area, and extract the tank without triggering rock slides that could compound the problem. Lieutenant Reynolds approached, tablet in hand. Sir, I prepared the briefing materials for today's scenarios as requested. Thank you, Lieutenant. Callahan took the tablet, noticing the young officer's slightly reddened eyes. Long night? Yes, sir. Reynolds hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. I've been reviewing my father's service records. There are inconsistencies I never noticed before. Callahan exchanged a quick glance with Reed. What kind of inconsistencies? The official report states he died due to enemy action while awaiting recovery after his tank was disabled. But there's no explanation for why the recovery team never reached him, despite being less than 2 kilometers away. Records from that period are often incomplete, Callahan said carefully. The chaos of the early Iraq War years. Reynolds nodded, but his expression remained troubled. My mother always said there was more to the story. I never pursued it until now. Before Callahan could respond, a staff car arrived carrying General Anderson and Colonel Wilson. The moment for personal conversation had passed. We'll discuss this later, Callahan promised quietly. Focus on the trials for now. As the evaluation team gathered, Anderson outlined the day's objectives. Yesterday gave us baseline performance metrics in standard conditions. Today, we'll test adaptability and problem-solving in complex situations. Wilson stepped forward, unable to completely mask his confidence despite yesterday's setback. The Iron Guardian systems have been optimized based on yesterday's data. We anticipate even better performance today. Callahan noticed Davis standing among the recovery team leaders, her expression neutral, but her eyes alert. Whatever she had discovered in Wilson's records was clearly still on her mind. Colonel Callahan, Anderson said, "Which of your teams would you like to lead off today's trials?" "Staff Sergeant Davis and her crew will go first," Callahan replied without hesitation. Davis moved forward, her team already geared up and ready. They'd spent the morning reviewing the scenario, developing multiple approaches depending on what they found when they reached the ravine. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant," Anderson nodded. Davis saluted sharply and turned toward her massive M88. As she walked away, Callahan saw her exchange a nearly imperceptible nod with Reed. Whatever they had planned, it was now in motion. The M88 roared to life, its powerful engine sending vibrations through the ground as it moved toward the testing area. Davis and her crew disappeared into the ravine, radio communication their only link to the observation post. "Approaching target," Davis's voice crackled over the speakers. "Terrain is highly unstable, multiple rock slides evident, tank position at approximately 70-degree angle, port side elevated." The observers watched on monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the ravine. Davis's M88 advanced cautiously, stopping 50 meters from the disabled tank. "Standard approach won't work here," Davis reported. "Soil composition too loose for direct pull. Preparing alternative extraction." What followed was a masterclass in recovery operations. Instead of attempting to winch the tank directly, Davis's team used the M88's dozer blade to carve a more stable path, reinforcing critical points with portable stabilizers they'd brought along precisely for such a scenario. "Notice how they're adapting to the terrain," Reed pointed out to Anderson, "creating their own solution rather than following standard procedure." Wilson frowned slightly but said nothing. After establishing a stable work area, Davis's team deployed their winch system in an unconventional configuration, using the A-frame to distribute the load across multiple attachment points. This prevented any single point from bearing too much stress that might trigger further rock slides. "Beginning extraction," Davis announced. The operation proceeded with methodical precision. When a minor rock slide threatened their progress, the team reacted instantly, adjusting their approach without pausing the extraction. In 47 minutes, they had successfully recovered the tank and navigated it safely out of the ravine. 47 minutes, 12 seconds, the timekeeper announced. "Impressive work, especially given the terrain challenges," Anderson acknowledged. Wilson merely nodded, his attention already on his own vehicle. "The Iron Guardian will demonstrate a more efficient approach." The remaining human teams performed their runs throughout the morning, each bringing their own techniques to the challenge. Times ranged from 43 to 52 minutes, with varying degrees of terrain disturbance. Reed's team posted the fastest time, a fact that seemed to irritate Wilson visibly. Finally, it was the Iron Guardian's turn. The robot approached the ravine with his characteristic silent efficiency, sensors mapping the terrain in real time as it calculated the optimal recovery path. "The Guardian's AI has analyzed the previous recovery attempts and synthesized the most effective elements of each," Wilson explained as the machine worked. "It's continually learning and improving." The Iron Guardian began by deploying ground-penetrating radar to assess soil stability, then used its articulated arms to position reinforcement structures at key points. Its movements were precise, almost elegant. "I'll admit that's impressive technology," Reed said quietly to Callahan. "If only it weren't being oversold by someone like Wilson." 30 minutes into the operation, the Iron Guardian had successfully stabilized the area and was preparing to extract the tank. Its winch system engaged, applying precisely calculated force to pull the disabled vehicle from its precarious position. That's when the first problem occurred. A section of the ravine wall, weakened by the previous extractions, began to collapse. The Iron Guardian's sensors detected the danger immediately, but its response protocol required recalculation of the entire operation, a process that took precious seconds. By the time it adjusted its approach, a significant rock slide had partially buried one side of the disabled tank. The robot paused again, reassessing the now changed situation. "What's happening?" Anderson asked, frowning at the delay. "The AI is adapting to the unexpected terrain change," Wilson explained, though his confident tone had faltered slightly. "It's calculating a new extraction plan." The Iron Guardian eventually resumed operations, clearing the debris and attempting a modified extraction. But the delay had cost them valuable time, and the final result was telling. 53 minutes, 40 seconds, the timekeeper announced. Wilson's face tightened. The Guardian encountered exceptional circumstances. The rock slide was an anomaly. An anomaly that any recovery team would expect in unstable terrain, Reed pointed out, which is why our teams brought additional stabilization equipment and were prepared to adapt on the fly. The important takeaway, Callahan added, is that while the Iron Guardian has impressive technological capabilities, it lacks the intuitive problem-solving and immediate adaptability of experienced human operators. Anderson studied the data on his tablet thoughtfully. The results speak for themselves. Human teams demonstrated superior adaptability in this scenario. Let's break for lunch before the afternoon trials. As the group dispersed, Callahan noticed Wilson pulling Dr. Harris aside, their conversation intense and clearly not going the way Wilson wanted. The colonel's face was flushed with anger as he jabbed his finger at a tablet display. "Trouble in paradise," Reed murmured, following Callahan's gaze. "Keep an eye on them," Callahan replied. "I need to speak with Davis." He found Davis checking over her M88, meticulously inspecting the winch system that had performed so admirably in the morning trial. "Excellent work out there, Sergeant," Callahan said as he approached. Davis straightened and saluted. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." When they were alone between the massive vehicle and the maintenance trailer, Callahan lowered his voice. "Have you had a chance to examine the files you recovered?" "Yes, sir. I spent most of the night going through them." Davis's expression hardened. Wilson deliberately abandoned Captain Reynolds. The logs show his unit received the distress call, acknowledged it, and then Wilson personally countermanded the recovery order. Why, Callahan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. According to his private notes, he determined the risk to his recovery vehicles outweighed the potential benefit of saving the tank and crew. Davis's voice was tight with controlled anger. He made a cost-benefit analysis and decided Captain Reynolds and his men weren't worth saving. Callahan felt cold fury building in his chest. The military made difficult decisions daily, but this wasn't a strategic calculation. It was cowardice disguised as pragmatism. "There's more," Davis continued. "After Captain Reynolds and his crew died, Wilson falsified communications records to make it appear the distress call had never been clearly received. He buried the incident and moved on with his career." "And the Iron Guardian is the culmination of that philosophy," Callahan said grimly. "A system that allows officers like Wilson to make recovery decisions from the safety of a command post miles away from the danger." "Exactly, sir. And the performance data I found shows they're well aware of the system's limitations. They've documented multiple catastrophic failures during testing, particularly in electronic warfare scenarios where communications were jammed or compromised." Callahan nodded slowly. "They're rushing an unproven system into service for political reasons, regardless of the potential cost in soldiers' lives." "What's our next move, sir?" "We continue with the trials, push the Iron Guardian to its limits, and prepare Lieutenant Reynolds for the truth about his father's death." Callahan's jaw tightened. "When the time is right, we'll use what you found to ensure Wilson can't do to other soldiers what he did to James Reynolds." As Davis returned to her team, Callahan stood alone beside the massive recovery vehicle, lost in thought. The M88 represented something more than just military hardware to him. It was a symbol of the human commitment to leave no one behind, to risk everything to save a fellow soldier. Wilson's clinical, remote approach to recovery operations threatened to erode that commitment, replacing it with cold calculations of acceptable losses. Not if Callahan could help it. Not while he still wore the uniform. The afternoon trials focused on night operations, a critical capability for any recovery team. Tank battles often continued after sunset, and disabled vehicles frequently needed extraction under cover of darkness. The testing area had been reconfigured to simulate a small urban environment, with buildings, narrow streets, and multiple obstacles. The disabled tank was positioned in a confined space between structures, with limited access points and simulated electrical hazards nearby. To level the playing field, both human teams and the Iron Guardian would be evaluated on their ability to perform recovery operations with minimal illumination and restricted communications, a common scenario during combat operations. Reed's team went first, navigating the darkened course with night vision equipment and years of experience operating in low-light conditions. Their approach was methodical but efficient, using minimal lighting to avoid creating targets for potential enemies. Recovery teams in combat zones often work with severely restricted illumination, Reed explained to Anderson as they watched the operation on infrared monitors. "Bright lights make you a target. We train extensively for these conditions." Reed's team completed the extraction in 38 minutes, an impressive time given the difficult conditions. The remaining human teams performed similarly, with times ranging from 35 to 42 minutes. Then came the Iron Guardian's turn. As darkness fell completely, the robot entered the simulated urban environment, its sensors penetrating the darkness far more effectively than human vision could. The Guardian utilizes multiple sensor types: infrared, thermal, LiDAR, and enhanced optical, Wilson explained proudly. Darkness poses no obstacle to its operations. Indeed, the robot navigated the course with impressive precision, identifying the optimal path to the disabled tank and beginning recovery procedures without hesitation. Its mechanical arms worked with the same efficiency they had demonstrated in daylight. "I'll give Wilson this," Reed muttered to Callahan. "The thing does see in the dark better than we do." But 20 minutes into the operation, a new wrinkle was introduced. As per the test parameters, a simulated electronic warfare attack began, jamming communications and introducing false signals into the battlefield environment. The effect on the Iron Guardian was immediate and dramatic. Cut off from its remote operators and bombarded with conflicting data, the robot's movements became hesitant, its previously smooth operations deteriorating into a series of starts and stops. "What's happening?" Anderson demanded, watching as the Iron Guardian froze completely, its articulated arms extended mid-task. Wilson and Dr. Harris huddled over their control console, frantically attempting to re-establish connection with their creation. "The jamming is stronger than anticipated," Harris explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We're implementing countermeasures now." After several tense minutes, the Iron Guardian resumed operations, though its movements remained noticeably less fluid. It eventually completed the recovery, but at a significant cost to its performance metrics. 57 minutes, 20 seconds, the timekeeper announced. Wilson's face was a mask of controlled fury. The electronic warfare conditions were unrealistically severe. "This doesn't represent a fair test of the Guardian's capabilities." "On the contrary," Callahan countered calmly, "these are precisely the conditions our recovery teams face in modern combat zones. Enemy forces specifically target command and control systems with electronic warfare to disrupt exactly this kind of operation. The difference," Reed added, "is that when communications go down, our human operators continue functioning at full capacity. They don't need constant connection to a remote operator to make decisions." Anderson studied the results with a troubled expression. "The vulnerability to electronic warfare is concerning, Colonel Wilson. Modern battlefields are saturated with these threats. We can enhance the Guardian's autonomous capabilities," Wilson argued, "reduce its reliance on remote operation." "At what cost to decision-making quality?" Callahan asked. "The more autonomous the system becomes, the more you sacrifice the human judgment you claim as its key advantage over conventional recovery vehicles." The tension between the two colonels was palpable, the fundamental philosophical divide evident to everyone present. Wilson believed technology could remove humans from danger. Callahan knew some dangers required the human touch to navigate successfully. As the group moved toward the command center for debriefing, Lieutenant Reynolds approached Callahan, keeping his voice low. "Sir, I need to speak with you, privately." Something in the young officer's tone made Callahan take notice. "My office, after the debriefing." The debriefing itself was tense, with Wilson repeatedly challenging the test parameters and arguing for modifications that would better showcase the Iron Guardian's strengths. Anderson, to his credit, held firm on the importance of realistic combat conditions. "The purpose of these trials isn't to make either system look good or bad," Anderson reminded everyone. "It's to determine which approach best serves our soldiers' needs in the field. So far, I'm seeing strengths and weaknesses on both sides." Callahan caught Davis's eye across the room. They both knew the trials were only part of the larger truth that needed to be exposed. Wilson's deception about the Iron Guardian's capabilities mirrored his deception 15 years ago about James Reynolds' death, a pattern of prioritizing his career over soldiers' lives. After the debriefing concluded, Callahan found Reynolds waiting outside his office, standing at rigid attention in the empty hallway. "At ease, Lieutenant," Callahan said, unlocking his door. "Come inside." Once the door closed behind them, Reynolds spoke without preamble. "Sir, I know what Colonel Wilson did to my father." Callahan carefully kept his expression neutral. "What do you mean, Lieutenant?" "I accessed the classified files on my father's death." Reynolds' voice was tight with controlled emotion. Wilson received his distress call. He ordered his recovery teams to stand down, claiming the risk was too high. My father and his crew bled out waiting for help that Wilson deliberately withheld. "How did you access those files?" Callahan asked. though he suspected the answer. Staff Sergeant Davis provided them, sir. Reynolds met Callahan's gaze directly. She told me you authorized her to recover them from Wilson's systems. Callahan sighed and gestured for Reynolds to sit. It's more complicated than that, but yes, we discovered evidence that Wilson falsified records regarding your father's death. Wait. The raw pain in the young officer's voice cut through his military discipline. Why would he leave them to die? Because Wilson has always believed that preserving equipment and his own reputation is more important than the hard, dangerous work of saving lives, Callahan said bluntly. The same philosophy that drives the Iron Guardian project, the idea that recovery operations can be conducted at a safe distance, without risk to the operators. Reynolds' hands clenched into fists on his knees. He's been walking around for 15 years, advancing his career, while my mother buried an empty coffin, while I grew up without a father. I understand your anger, Lieutenant, but right now we need to focus on the bigger picture. Callahan leaned forward. Wilson's Iron Guardian project isn't just about recovery vehicles. It represents a fundamental shift in how the Army approaches risk and responsibility in combat operations. If we expose him now, without the proper context, it becomes just another scandal that the Pentagon will bury. What are you suggesting, sir? I'm suggesting we use the trials to demonstrate conclusively that human recovery teams are irreplaceable, that the Iron Guardian concept is fundamentally flawed. Then when the evidence about your father is revealed, it won't be seen as an isolated incident, but as part of a pattern of prioritizing technology and political convenience over soldiers' lives. Reynolds was silent for a long moment, visibly struggling to process both his personal grief and the strategic implications Callahan had outlined. My father believed in duty above all else, he said finally. In doing what's right, not what's easy or safe. I need to honor that. And you will, Callahan assured him. But we need to be smart about how we proceed. For now, continue as the liaison officer. Gather every piece of data that shows the Iron Guardian's limitations. When the time comes, your testimony about both the technical failings and the personal cost of Wilson's philosophy will be crucial. Reynolds nodded, his young face hardening with resolve. I understand, sir. What's our next move? Tomorrow's trials include the most challenging scenarios yet. We push the Iron Guardian to its breaking point. Show Anderson and the evaluation team that no matter how sophisticated the technology, there are situations where human judgment, courage, and adaptability simply can't be replaced. After Reynolds departed, Callahan sat alone in his office, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He'd started this investigation seeking justice for James Reynolds, but the stakes had grown far beyond one man's death. This was now about the future of recovery operations throughout the Army, and by extension, the lives of countless tank crews who would depend on those operations in future conflicts. His phone buzzed with a message from Reed. Wilson requesting changes to tomorrow's trial parameters. Emergency meeting with Anderson in 10. So Wilson was making his move, trying to alter the testing conditions to favor his creation. Callahan had expected as much after today's disappointing performance. As he headed toward the meeting, Callahan's prosthetic leg ached, a reminder of his own experience being pulled from a burning tank by human hands, not mechanical arms. Some debts could only be repaid in kind, through the human commitment to leave no one behind. Tomorrow would determine whether that commitment remained at the heart of the Army's recovery doctrine, or whether it would be replaced by Wilson's cold calculations and remote operators. The emergency meeting was already underway when Callahan arrived at Anderson's temporary office. Wilson stood before a digital display, gesturing emphatically at data charts while Dr. Harris operated the presentation controls. The electronic warfare conditions in today's test exceeded any realistic battlefield scenario, Wilson was saying. The signal jamming was orders of magnitude stronger than what our forces have encountered in recent conflicts. Anderson looked up as Callahan entered. Colonel, glad you could join us. Colonel Wilson is proposing modifications to tomorrow's testing protocols. I see. Callahan took a seat, studying Wilson's agitated demeanor with interest. What specific changes are you suggesting, Colonel? Wilson turned to face him, barely concealing his frustration. The electronic warfare component needs to be scaled back to realistic levels. Today's test created conditions that would disable any network system, military or otherwise. Interesting perspective, Callahan replied evenly. Considering that Russia, China, and even non-state actors have demonstrated electronic warfare capabilities that exceed what we simulated today. That's speculative at best, Wilson countered. Intelligence reports don't support that level of capability. Perhaps not the intelligence reports you've seen, Callahan said, the implication clear. But those of us who've been in theater recently have direct experience with increasingly sophisticated EW attacks. Anderson raised a hand to forestall the brewing argument. Gentlemen, please. The purpose of these trials is to evaluate performance under varied conditions, including worst-case scenarios. Exactly my point, General, Wilson pressed. But scenarios should remain within the realm of the possible, not venture into science fiction. Callahan leaned forward. With respect, there's nothing fictional about communications breakdown in combat. We're not testing whether the Iron Guardian performs well under ideal conditions. We know it does. We're testing whether it remains functional when conditions deteriorate, as they inevitably do in battle. Harris spoke up for the first time. The Guardian's autonomous capabilities are designed to handle communications disruption. Today's tests simply didn't allow sufficient time for the backup systems to engage properly. And in real combat, the enemy provides a convenient pause while backup systems initialize? Callahan asked, his tone making clear the absurdity of the suggestion. Anderson sighed, rubbing his temples. What specifically are you proposing, Colonel Wilson? 3 modifications, Wilson replied promptly. First, realistic EW conditions based on documented battlefield encounters. Second, a progressive implementation of jamming rather than immediate full-spectrum disruption. Third, equal conditions for both human teams and the Guardian. All tests must affect both approaches identically. The third point is reasonable, Callahan conceded, but the first 2 amount to creating artificial advantages for a network system in an environment specifically designed to disrupt networks. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with technical details and operational realities weighed against each other. Eventually, Anderson made his decision. Tomorrow's trials will proceed with the originally planned parameters, with 1 modification. Electronic warfare effects will be introduced progressively rather than instantaneously, simulating an enemy's escalating EW effort. Anderson looked between the 2 colonels. This provides a more realistic scenario while still testing both systems' ability to adapt to deteriorating conditions. Wilson clearly wasn't satisfied but nodded stiffly. We'll prepare the Guardian accordingly. After the meeting adjourned, Reed joined Callahan in the hallway. He's worried, Reed observed quietly. The Guardian isn't performing as advertised, and he knows it. More than worried, Callahan replied. He's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, Reed lowered his voice further. Davis has found something else in the files she recovered. Wilson has been systematically falsifying the Iron Guardian's test results for over a year. Performance failures, system crashes, operational limitations, all buried under modified data and selective reporting. Callahan wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still sparked anger. How extensive is the deception? Extensive enough that if the Appropriations Committee saw the real data, they'd shut down the program immediately. Reed shook his head in disgust. The Guardian's autonomous mode fails catastrophically in 38% of complex recovery scenarios. The only reason it performs at all is continuous human intervention from the remote operators. The irony wasn't lost on Callahan. The system designed to remove humans from danger actually required constant human supervision to function, meaning it combined the worst aspects of both approaches. Remote operators making life or death decisions through limited sensor feeds, without the immediate situational awareness of being physically present. We need to compile all this evidence properly, Callahan decided. Official format with full documentation. When we present it to Anderson, there can be no question about its authenticity. Davis is already working on it, Reed assured him. But there's something else you should know. Wilson has been asking questions about Reynolds, specifically about whether he's related to Captain James Reynolds. Callahan felt a chill. He's making the connection. Seems that way. If he realizes the lieutenant is James Reynolds' son, he might suspect we're investigating his past. Then we need to accelerate our timeline, Callahan said firmly. Have Davis finish compiling the evidence tonight. We'll present it to Anderson immediately after tomorrow's final trials. As they parted ways, Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a critical juncture. Wilson was cornered, his prize project failing to meet expectations, his past misdeeds threatening to surface. A dangerous combination. Callahan had seen men like Wilson before, officers whose careers meant more to them than the soldiers under their command. When threatened, they became unpredictable, willing to sacrifice anything or anyone to protect themselves. Tomorrow would require vigilance, not just to demonstrate the superiority of human recovery teams, but to ensure Wilson didn't take desperate measures to salvage his failing project and reputation. Back in his quarters, Callahan reviewed the scenarios planned for the final day of trials. The culminating test was designated Red Zone Recovery, a full combat simulation with multiple disabled vehicles, active opposition forces, and a complex extraction under fire. It would be the ultimate test of both recovery approaches. As he studied the terrain maps and scenario parameters, Callahan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about exposing Wilson's deception or preserving the M88 program. It was about ensuring that when the next generation of tank crews went into battle, they could trust that if the worst happened, their brothers and sisters in arms would come for them, no matter the risk. That sacred trust had been betrayed once, in the Iraqi desert where James Reynolds died waiting for help that never came. Callahan was determined it wouldn't happen again. Dawn broke over Fort Irwin with a blood-red sky, the sun rising through a thin layer of dust carried on the desert wind. The final day of trials had arrived, and with it, the most demanding tests yet. Callahan found his recovery teams already assembled in the maintenance bay, checking equipment with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for actual combat. The atmosphere was charged with purpose. Everyone understood what was at stake. "Gather around," Callahan called, and the room quieted immediately. "Today we demonstrate why recovery operations require more than sophisticated machines. They require heart, courage, and the unbreakable commitment to leave no one behind." He looked around at the faces before him. Men and women who had pulled damaged tanks from the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, often under enemy fire, risking their lives to save their fellow soldiers. "The Iron Guardian is impressive technology," Callahan continued. "It's faster in optimal conditions. Its winch systems are more powerful, its sensors more sensitive than human eyes. But technology alone cannot replace what makes you exceptional: your judgment under pressure, your ability to improvise when plans fail, your willingness to risk everything for your brothers and sisters in arms." Read step one forward. Today's final scenario is designated Red Zone Recovery, multiple disabled vehicles in active combat conditions. OOP4 will be using live simulation rounds and electronic warfare measures. The environment will degrade progressively throughout the operation. Davis raised her hand. "Sir, will the Iron Guardian be operating under the same conditions?" "Identical conditions," Callahan confirmed. General Anderson was very clear on that point. Both approaches will face the same challenges. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering specific tactical considerations and contingency plans. As the teams dispersed to make final preparations, Callahan noticed Lieutenant Reynolds standing slightly apart, his expression troubled. "Something on your mind, Lieutenant?" Callahan asked quietly. Reynolds hesitated. "Sir, I've been thinking about my father, about what happened to him." Callahan waited, giving the young officer space to continue. "He would want me to focus on the mission, not on personal vengeance against Wilson." Reynolds straightened his shoulders. "I need to set aside my anger for now and help ensure these trials demonstrate the truth not just about the Iron Guardian, but about the importance of human courage and commitment in recovery operations." Callahan felt a surge of pride. "Your father would be proud of that perspective, Lieutenant. Very proud indeed." At 700 hours, the evaluation team assembled at the command center overlooking the vast training area designated for the final trials. The scenario was elaborate: 3 disabled vehicles scattered across a simulated urban battlefield, with opposition forces in defensive positions and a variety of obstacles, both physical and electronic. Recovery teams would need to assess the situation, prioritize extraction targets, and execute under fire a comprehensive test of both technical capability and tactical judgment. Anderson addressed the assembled observers. "Today's trials represent the culmination of our evaluation process. Both approaches, human recovery teams and the automated Iron Guardian, will face identical conditions designed to simulate worst-case combat scenarios." Wilson stood nearby, outwardly composed but betrayed by the tension in his jaw and the constant checking of his tablet. Dr. Harris and her technical team huddled around their control station, making last-minute adjustments to the Guardian's operational parameters. "Colonel Callahan, are your teams ready?" Anderson asked. "Yes, sir. Recovery Team Alpha, led by Sergeant Major Reed, will conduct the first trial." Reed's M88 was already positioned at the starting point, engine rumbling with suppressed power. Inside the massive vehicle, his crew performed final equipment checks with the quiet efficiency of veteran soldiers. "Colonel Wilson, is the Iron Guardian prepared?" Wilson nodded stiffly. Yes, General. All systems are operational and optimized based on our learnings from previous trials. Very well. Anderson turned to the official timekeeper. Commence Trial 1. A red flare arced into the sky, signaling the start of the exercise. Immediately, the simulated battlefield came alive with activity. Opposition forces opened fire with training rounds that produced realistic effects without lethal consequences. Smoke obscured key areas, and the first electronic warfare measures activated, degrading communications. Reed's M88 rolled forward into the chaos, moving with surprising agility for such a massive vehicle. From the command center, observers watched through multiple camera feeds as the recovery team navigated the complex environment. First target identified, Reed's voice crackled over the command net. Disabled Bradley at grid reference Echo 59er. Multiple simulated casualties, priority extraction. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Reed's team moved toward the stricken vehicle, using buildings for cover where possible. When they encountered a barricaded roadway, they didn't hesitate. The M88's massive bulk simply pushed through the obstacle, clearing a path. Notice the immediate decision-making, Callahan pointed out to Anderson. No pausing for analysis or recalculation. They see a problem, they solve it, and they keep moving. As Reed's team reached the first disabled vehicle, opposition fire intensified. The M88's armor absorbed most impacts, but the recovery operation itself became more challenging under continuous fire. This is where human adaptability shines, Callahan continued his commentary. Watch how they'll modify standard procedures to account for the threat environment. Indeed, Reed's team executed a modified recovery protocol, using the M88 itself as a shield for the disabled Bradley while they established tow connections. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, a remarkable achievement under fire. First vehicle secured, Reed reported, moving to extraction point Alpha before proceeding to second target. The M88 towed the Bradley to a designated safe area, then immediately redeployed toward the second disabled vehicle without pausing for rest or reassessment. As they moved, the electronic warfare environment intensified, with communications becoming increasingly disrupted and navigational systems showing false readings. EW conditions degrading rapidly. Reed's voice came through with noticeable static, switching to visual navigation and pre-planned rally points. Throughout the operation, Reed's team demonstrated the value of their training and experience. When standard approaches wouldn't work, they improvised. When communications failed, they relied on pre-established protocols. When unexpected obstacles appeared, they adapted without hesitation. 97 minutes after the exercise began, Reed's M88 towed the third and final disabled vehicle into the extraction zone. Despite the challenging conditions, his team had successfully recovered all targets with minimal additional damage. 97 minutes, 14 seconds, the timekeepers announced. All objectives completed successfully. Anderson nodded appreciatively. Impressive performance, especially considering the progressive degradation of the operational environment. The remaining human teams performed their runs throughout the morning, with times ranging from 95 to 112 minutes. Each team brought their own approach to the challenges, but all demonstrated the core strengths Callahan had emphasized: adaptability, judgment, and determination. After a brief break for the evaluation team, it was the Iron Guardian's turn to tackle the identical scenario. The robot rolled to the starting position with mechanical precision, its systems fully restored after yesterday's difficulties. The Guardian's AI has been updated with comprehensive tactical analyses of the previous human team runs, Wilson explained to Anderson. It's continually learning and improving its approach. As the second red flare soared skyward, the Iron Guardian moved into the simulated battlefield. Its initial progress was impressive. The machine navigated obstacles efficiently and quickly identified the first disabled vehicle. Target 1 located, Dr. Harris narrated from the control station, initiating recovery protocol Delta. The Guardian's articulated arms deployed, securing connection points to the disabled Bradley with precision that matched or exceeded human performance. Its powerful winch systems engaged, beginning the extraction with smooth efficiency. Time to first vehicle secure 8 minutes 20 seconds, the timekeeper noted, approximately 15% faster than human teams. Wilson allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The Guardian was performing exactly as designed in this initial phase. But as the exercise progressed and conditions deteriorated according to the scenario parameters, the limitations of the automated approach became increasingly apparent. The progressive electronic warfare measures created particular challenges, forcing the Guardian to repeatedly switch between autonomous operation and remote control as communications fluctuated. "We're experiencing intermittent connection issues," Dr. Harris reported, her fingers flying across the control console, switching to backup communication channels. Unlike the human teams, who had anticipated and prepared for communications failure, the Guardian's operations became increasingly disjointed as it struggled to maintain connection with its operators. Its movements grew hesitant, its decision-making visibly slowed. "The AI is compensating for the communications degradation," Wilson explained, though his confident tone had faded. "It's prioritizing mission-critical functions." When the Guardian reached the second disabled vehicle, positioned in a narrow alleyway with limited maneuver space, its problems compounded. The machine attempted multiple approaches, each time recalculating as its sensors struggled to develop a complete picture of the complex environment. "It can't decide on an approach," Reed observed quietly to Callahan. "Too many variables, too much uncertainty." After nearly 15 minutes of abortive attempts, the Guardian finally established a successful connection and began extracting the second vehicle. But the delay had cost valuable time, and the final phase of electronic warfare measures was about to begin. Implementing Phase 3 EW conditions, the exercise controller announced. Almost immediately, the Iron Guardian froze in place, its systems overwhelmed by the combination of jamming, false signals, and data corruption. The screen at Dr. Harris's control station flashed with error messages and system warnings. "We've lost primary connection," she reported tensely, attempting to establish link through emergency protocols. For long minutes, the Guardian remained immobile on the battlefield, a stark contrast to the human teams who had continued functioning effectively even when communications collapsed completely. Wilson's face had lost all color. "This level of electronic warfare is unrealistic," he protested to Anderson. "No current adversary can generate this kind of comprehensive spectrum denial." "On the contrary," Anderson replied evenly, "this scenario is based on classified assessments of near-peer capabilities we expect to face in the next conflict. If anything, we've understated the electronic threat environment." Eventually, the Guardian's backup systems managed to establish limited functionality, allowing the machine to complete the extraction of the second vehicle through basic autonomous operations. But its movements were jerky, its decision-making clearly compromised by the loss of connection to its human operators. The third disabled vehicle proved to be the breaking point. Positioned in a collapsed building with multiple access challenges, it required complex problem-solving and adaptability that the Guardian's autonomous systems simply couldn't provide without human guidance. After repeated failed attempts and with the exercise clock ticking well past the 2-hour mark, Anderson finally called a halt to the trial. "I believe we've seen enough," he said, his expression grave. "The Iron Guardian has demonstrated both impressive capabilities and significant limitations under realistic combat conditions." The final time was recorded at 143 minutes, with only 2 of 3 objectives successfully completed, a clear failure against the human team's performance. Wilson stood rigid beside the control station, his project's weaknesses exposed for all to see. "With additional development time, we can address the autonomous decision-making limitations," he argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Anderson acknowledged, "but these trials were designed to evaluate current capabilities, not future potential. Based on what we've seen, the Iron Guardian concept requires significant further development before it could reasonably replace human recovery teams." As the evaluation team began to disperse, Callahan caught Reed's eye and nodded slightly. Now was the time to present the additional evidence they had uncovered, the falsified test data, and most damning, the truth about Wilson's role in James Reynolds' death. But before Callahan could approach Anderson, an aide rushed into the command center, his expression urgent. "General, we have a situation developing in Training Area Bravo. One of the M1A2 tanks participating in the current rotation has experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure. The crew is trapped inside, and there are reports of an ammunition fire." Anderson immediately shifted to crisis mode. "How far is the nearest recovery team?" "That's the problem, sir. The accident occurred in the far western sector. Nearest recovery assets are at least 30 minutes out." The aide hesitated. "And sir, the tank commander is Colonel Peterson's son, from 3rd Brigade." Peterson was Anderson's West Point classmate and close friend. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. Anderson turned to Callahan. Colonel, how quickly can you deploy a recovery team? Reed's M88 is fully operational and nearby, Callahan replied without hesitation. They could reach the site in under 15 minutes. Get them moving immediately. Anderson's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Wilson stepped forward and, General, the Iron Guardian is also operational. Its speed across open terrain exceeds the M88 significantly. It could reach the site faster. Anderson looked between the two colonels, the weight of command heavy in his expression. A fellow officer's son was trapped in a disabled tank with a potential ammunition fire, a nightmare scenario for any tanker. Deploy both assets, he decided. Whoever reaches the site first initiates recovery. This isn't a competition anymore. Gentlemen, this is a real-world emergency response. As Callahan rushed to coordinate with Reed, he caught a glimpse of Wilson's face. Beneath the professional concern, there was something else, a calculating look that sent a chill down Callahan's spine. The Iron Guardian might have failed the formal evaluation, but Wilson clearly saw this emergency as an opportunity to demonstrate his creation's value in the most dramatic way possible by saving the son of one of the Pentagon's most influential officers. The stakes had just risen exponentially. No longer were they simply deciding the future of recovery doctrine. Now, young lives hung in the balance, a cruel echo of the situation 15 years ago when Wilson had abandoned James Reynolds to die. History was repeating itself, but this time Callahan was determined the outcome would be different. The emergency call transformed Fort Irwin's atmosphere instantly. What had been a controlled evaluation became a desperate race against time. Reed's M88 Recovery Vehicle roared to life, its massive engine thundering as he guided it toward the western training sector where the stricken tank waited. Recovery 1 rolling, ETA 12 minutes to target site, Reed reported over the command net, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. Simultaneously, Wilson's team activated the Iron Guardian, its electric motors humming as it accelerated across the desert terrain. Unencumbered by the weight of a crew compartment or conventional armor. Guardian deployed, estimated arrival in 9 minutes, Dr. Harris announced, her fingers flying across the control console. From the command center, Callahan watched both vehicles on tactical displays, their position markers moving rapidly across digital terrain. He stood behind Reynolds, who monitored communications and relayed critical information. "What's the situation at the tank?" Callahan asked. Reynolds glanced up from his console, his expression grim. "Primary power failure, backup systems compromised. Commander reports electrical fire inside the crew compartment. Hatches jammed or inoperable. 4 personnel trapped. 4 lives hanging in the balance. And one of them the son of Colonel Peterson, Anderson's close friend. The personal stakes had escalated beyond anything they could have anticipated. "Sir," Reynolds added quietly, "the tank commander is Lieutenant Scott Peterson. He was in my class at West Point." The personal connection made the situation even more fraught. Callahan placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Reed will get them out, trust in that." Anderson paced behind them, his normally composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "What's the status of fire suppression systems in the tank?" he demanded. "Automated systems failed with the electrical systems," Reynolds reported. "Crew is using portable extinguishers, but smoke is building up inside the compartment." Wilson stood at his own control station, eyes fixed on the Iron Guardian's telemetry. "We're routing Guardian through the most direct approach path. Current projections show arrival 3 minutes ahead of the M88. Callahan studied the map carefully. "That path takes the Guardian across the washboard," he observed, referring to a notoriously difficult stretch of terrain with alternating ridges and depressions. "That's challenging ground, even for tracked vehicles." "The Guardian's adaptive suspension can handle it," Wilson replied confidently. "Its ground pressure distribution adjusts in real time to terrain conditions." Callahan exchanged a glance with Davis, who had joined them in the command center. They both knew the Iron Guardian had demonstrated impressive capabilities on prepared courses, but the washboard was different, unpredictable, unforgiving terrain that had humbled many experienced drivers. "Reed knows this terrain better than anyone," Callahan said. "He's taking a longer route, but one he knows is passable at speed." On the displays, they could see the 2 rescue vehicles racing toward the disabled tank. The Iron Guardian had indeed taken the lead, its sophisticated systems pushing it across the desert faster than the conventional M88 could travel. 8 minutes to target," Harris announced, monitoring the Guardian's progress. Then the first complication arose. The Iron Guardian hit the washboard at full speed, its sensors detecting the uneven terrain too late to adjust properly. The vehicle bounced violently, temporarily losing traction as its suspension struggled to compensate. Reducing speed to stabilize, Harris reported, her confident tone faltering slightly. Terrain is more irregular than our mapping indicated. Wilson leaned over her shoulder, his expression tightening. Maintain maximum safe speed. We need to reach that tank first. Callahan caught the desperation in Wilson's voice. This wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about proving his creation's worth after its failures in the formal evaluation. Wilson needed a dramatic rescue to salvage both the Iron Guardian program and his own career. Meanwhile, Reed's M88 maintained a steady pace along its longer but more reliable route. 6 minutes to target, Reed reported calmly. Crew status? Deteriorating, Sir Reynolds replied, monitoring the communications from the disabled tank. Smoke increasing. Two crew members are reporting difficulty breathing. Commander has ordered oxygen masks deployed. Anderson's face had gone pale. Those masks only provide limited duration support in a smoke-filled environment. Both recovery assets are inbound, Sir, Callahan reminded him. Either the Guardian or Reed's team will reach them within minutes. The Iron Guardian continued to struggle across the washboard, its speed advantage diminishing as it navigated the challenging terrain. Then disaster struck. As the robot crested a particularly steep ridge, its right side dropped unexpectedly into a depression hidden by shadow. The sudden shift in weight distribution caused the vehicle to list dramatically to one side. We've hit unstable ground, Harris reported urgently, compensating. But the Guardian's attempts to redistribute weight only worsened the situation. The robot began to slide sideways down the ridge face, its treads spinning uselessly as loose soil gave way beneath them. Guardian is compromised, Harris announced, her voice tight with tension. We're implementing recovery protocols. On the screen, they watched as the Iron Guardian attempted to extricate itself, its articulated arms deploying to provide additional stabilization points. But the more it struggled, the deeper it sank into the soft soil of the depression. What's happening? Anderson demanded. The Guardian has encountered what we call a sand trap, Callahan explained, a pocket of loose soil that appears stable until weight is applied. It's a common hazard in this training area, one that experienced drivers are trained to recognize and avoid. Wilson's face had drained of color. We can recover, just need to redistribute weight and apply progressive traction. But Callahan could see the truth. The Iron Guardian was effectively immobilized, at least temporarily. The sophisticated robot, designed to rescue other vehicles, now needed rescue itself. Reed, be advised, Guardian is disabled in the washboard, Callahan reported over the command net. You are now the only recovery asset en route to the target. Understood, Reed replied, his voice betraying no emotion. 4 minutes to target. Preparing extraction protocols. The atmosphere in the command center shifted as the reality became clear. The lives of 4 soldiers now depended entirely on Reed's human team and their conventional M88. Technology had failed. Human experience and determination were the last hope. Anderson turned to Callahan, his expression grave. Will they make it in time? If anyone can, it's Reed, Callahan answered, absolute confidence in his voice. He's pulled off more difficult extractions under worse conditions. As Reed's M88 neared the disabled tank, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Reports from the trapped crew indicated the fire had spread, and oxygen levels were dropping rapidly inside the sealed compartment. Visual contact with the target, Reed reported. Heavy smoke visible from the engine compartment. No external flames yet, but significant heat signature. The command center fell silent as they watched Reed's M88 approach the stricken tank. The recovery vehicle positioned itself strategically, using its bulk to shield the damaged tank from the desert wind that was fanning the internal fire. Beginning extraction, Reed announced. Standard protocols won't work here. Hatches appear warped from internal heat. Implementing alternate approach. What followed was a masterclass in experience-driven adaptation. Rather than attempting to tow the disabled tank, Reed's team deployed their specialized equipment to access the crew compartment directly. Using the M88's powerful winch system in an unconventional configuration, they applied precise pressure to the commander's hatch, forcing it open despite the warping. Hatch breached, Reed reported, deploying extraction team with breathing apparatus. 2 crew members from the M88 immediately entered the smoke-filled tank, disappearing from view of the command center's cameras. Tense minutes passed as they worked to extract the trapped soldiers. First crew member coming out, Reed finally announced, conscious but suffering from smoke inhalation. One by one, the tank crew emerged, each assisted by Reed's team and immediately provided with oxygen and medical attention. Lieutenant Peterson, the tank commander, came out last, supported by two recovery team members, his uniform singed and his face blackened with soot. All personnel extracted, Reed confirmed. 4 survivors, all requiring medical attention but stable. Medevac helicopter inbound. A collective sigh of relief swept through the command center. Anderson stepped away briefly, presumably to contact his friend, Colonel Peterson, with the good news. Callahan looked over at Wilson, who stood motionless before his control station, watching as the Iron Guardian continued its futile attempts to free itself from the sand trap. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The human team successfully completing a complex, life-saving extraction, while the sophisticated robot remained helplessly stuck, unable to fulfill its primary function. Sometimes, Callahan said quietly, approaching Wilson, the most sophisticated solution isn't the right one. Sometimes what you need is human judgment, experience, and the willingness to risk everything for your fellow soldiers. Wilson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the monitors displaying his failed creation. But the defeat in his posture told Callahan everything he needed to know. The Iron Guardian program, at least in its current form, was finished. As medical personnel arrived at the extraction site and began treating the rescued tank crew, Reed approached one of the command center cameras, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Recovery operation complete," he reported formally. "Request permission to deploy recovery assets to extract the Iron Guardian." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the command center. The machine designed to replace human recovery teams now required those very teams to rescue it. "Permission granted," Anderson replied, returning to the command area. And Sergeant Major Reed, "Exceptional work today. Truly exceptional." Reed nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to coordinate the new recovery operation. The day's events had demonstrated beyond any doubt the value of human-operated recovery teams. But Callahan knew their work wasn't finished. The evidence of Wilson's past deception regarding James Reynolds' death still needed to be addressed. Justice delayed was about to be delivered. 3 hours later, the command center had transformed from crisis management hub to debriefing room. The rescued tank crew had been transported to the base hospital, all in stable condition. Reed's team had successfully extracted the Iron Guardian from its predicament, towing the sophisticated robot back to the maintenance area where Dr. Harris and her technicians worked to assess the damage. General Anderson called the evaluation team together for what everyone understood would be the final assessment of the comparative trials. "Today's events," Anderson began, his voice grave, "provided an unplanned but invaluable real-world test of both recovery approaches. While I regret the circumstances that necessitated emergency response, I cannot ignore what those circumstances revealed." He turned to Wilson. "Colonel, the Iron Guardian demonstrated impressive capabilities throughout these trials. Its speed, precision, and technical sophistication are undeniable. However, it also demonstrated critical vulnerabilities, particularly in adaptive decision-making, environmental navigation, and independent operation under communications degradation." Wilson stood rigidly at attention, his face an expressionless mask. "Sir, with additional development time, many of these limitations could be addressed." "Perhaps," Anderson conceded, "but we must make decisions based on current capabilities, not future potential." And today made one thing abundantly clear. When lives are at stake, there is no substitute for human judgment, experience, and courage. He turned to Callahan and Reed. "The performance of your recovery teams, culminating in today's successful extraction under life-threatening conditions, has demonstrated the continued relevance and necessity of human-operated recovery vehicles." Callahan nodded acknowledgement but remained silent. The professional evaluation was proceeding as he'd hoped, but the personal reckoning with Wilson still loomed. "My recommendation to the Appropriations Committee will be clear," Anderson continued. "While robotic recovery systems show promise as a supplementary capability, they cannot and should not replace human-operated M88 recovery vehicles in frontline operations. Further development of the Iron Guardian should proceed as a complementary system, not a replacement." Wilson's jaw tightened visibly, but he maintained his professional composure. "I understand, General, though I respectfully maintain that with refinement, autonomous systems will eventually surpass human capabilities in most recovery scenarios." "That may well be true someday, Colonel," Anderson replied. "But today is not that day. And until that day comes, we will not gamble with soldiers' lives on unproven technology." As the formal debriefing concluded, Callahan exchanged a glance with Reed and Davis. The moment had come. Lieutenant Reynolds stood nearby, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on Wilson. "General Anderson," Callahan said, stepping forward, "before we conclude, there's another matter that requires your attention. A matter directly relevant to Colonel Wilson's judgment and professional conduct." Wilson's head snapped toward Callahan, alarm flashing across his features. "What matter is this, Colonel?" Anderson asked, his expression cautious. "Staff Sergeant Davis has recovered documentation from Colonel Wilson's files, evidence of serious professional misconduct that directly relates to his development of the Iron Guardian concept." Davis stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Sir, while examining the Iron Guardian's operational protocols, I discovered archived files dating back to 2005 relating to a recovery operation in Iraq." Wilson interrupted, his voice sharp. "General, any files retrieved from my systems without proper authorization constitute a security breach and should not be considered in these proceedings. The files were accessed during a standard security compatibility check that you authorized, Colonel," Callahan countered smoothly, "and their contents are directly relevant to understanding your approach to recovery operations and risk assessment." Anderson studied both men for a long moment. "I'll hear what Staff Sergeant Davis has found. Proceed, Sergeant." Davis activated her tablet, displaying documents on the main screen. "These are communications logs and after-action reports from April 2005, during Colonel Wilson's deployment as commander of a recovery unit in Iraq. They document a distress call from a disabled tank commanded by Captain James Reynolds, requesting immediate recovery assistance." At the mention of his father's name, Lieutenant Reynolds stiffened visibly but remained silent. "The logs show clearly that Colonel Wilson received the distress call, acknowledged it, and then deliberately ordered his recovery teams to stand down, citing excessive risk despite multiple assessments from his team leaders that the recovery was viable." Wilson's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Davis, Callahan, and finally settling on Lieutenant Reynolds as the connection suddenly became clear to him. "Captain Reynolds and his entire crew subsequently died when their ammunition detonated while awaiting recovery," Davis continued, her voice steady but tight with controlled anger. "Most damning, Colonel Wilson then falsified communications records to indicate the distress call had never been clearly received, effectively covering up his decision to abandon fellow soldiers." A heavy silence fell over the room. Anderson's expression had darkened with each revealed detail. "Is this accurate, Colonel Wilson?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Wilson drew himself up, desperation evident in his eyes. "General, these events occurred 15 years ago in the fog of combat. Decisions made under such conditions should not be second-guessed by those who weren't there." "That's not a denial," Anderson observed coldly. "The recovery operation presented unacceptable risk to my teams," Wilson insisted. "As commander, I had to make difficult decisions balancing potential losses against potential gains. This is precisely why remote recovery systems like the Iron Guardian are necessary to remove human operators from such dangerous situations." "So you admit you received Captain Reynolds' distress call and chose not to respond?" Anderson pressed. Wilson hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "I made a tactical decision based on the information available at the time." Lieutenant Reynolds finally stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Captain James Reynolds was my father, sir. He and his crew trusted that their brothers in arms would come for them if they were in trouble. That trust was betrayed." Wilson's eyes widened as the full implications became clear. "Lieutenant, you cannot possibly understand the complexities of command decisions in combat environments. Your father's situation was tragic, but sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Callahan interjected, unable to contain his contempt. "Or your career advancement. Because the records also show you falsified official reports afterward, concealing your decision and avoiding any accountability." Anderson raised a hand, silencing the brewing confrontation. "Colonel Wilson, these accusations are extremely serious. If substantiated, they constitute dereliction of duty, falsification of official records, and conduct unbecoming an officer." "General, this is clearly a coordinated attempt to discredit both me and the Iron Guardian program," Wilson protested. "The timing alone should make that obvious." "The timing," Reed spoke up for the first time, "is because your actions 15 years ago and your actions today spring from the same flawed philosophy that technology can replace human courage and commitment. that difficult decisions can be outsourced to algorithms and remote operators safely distanced from their consequences. Anderson studied the documents on the screen for a long moment, his expression grave. Colonel Wilson, you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation into these allegations. You will surrender all project materials and return to Washington immediately for administrative proceedings. Wilson stood frozen, his career collapsing before his eyes. General, I urge you to reconsider. The Iron Guardian represents the future of recovery operations, regardless of what happened 15 years ago. That's where you're wrong, Colonel, Anderson replied firmly. What happened 15 years ago is precisely why the Iron Guardian is the wrong approach. Recovery operations aren't just about mechanical capability, they're about the sacred promise we make to our soldiers that we will never leave them behind. A promise you broke, and one that no machine, however sophisticated, can truly keep. As military police arrived to escort Wilson from the command center, Lieutenant Reynolds approached Callahan, his expression a complex mixture of grief, vindication, and uncertainty. Sir, I don't know how to feel about this, he admitted quietly. That's understandable, Callahan replied. Finding out the truth doesn't magically heal old wounds, but it does allow them to finally start healing properly. Reynolds nodded slowly. My mother always said my father died believing help was on the way, that even in his final moments, he trusted in his fellow soldiers. His voice broke slightly. At least now I know why that help never came, and that it wasn't because he was forgotten or abandoned by everyone. Your father was a fine officer and a good man, Callahan said, placing a hand on the young lieutenant's shoulder. The system failed him 15 years ago, but today, that same system finally delivered a measure of justice. As Reynolds moved away to process his emotions privately, Reed joined Callahan. So what happens now? The sergeant major asked. Now, Callahan said thoughtfully, we ensure the lessons from these trials aren't forgotten. That the Army understands the true value of human recovery teams isn't just in their technical capability, but in their unwavering commitment to leave no one behind, no matter the risk. Reed nodded in agreement. In the Iron Guardian, technology has its place, Callahan acknowledged, but as a tool that serves human operators, not replaces them. Perhaps someday a hybrid approach will prove most effective, human judgment guiding advanced machines. That sounds suspiciously like wisdom, sir, Reed observed with a hint of a smile. Just experience, Tom, hard-earned experience. 2 weeks later, Callahan stood beside Reed in the massive maintenance bay of Fort Irwin, watching as crews prepared their M88s for the next training rotation. The official report on the comparative trials had been submitted to the Pentagon, with Anderson's unequivocal recommendation to maintain and modernize the human-operated M88 fleet while continuing limited development of robotic assistance systems under new leadership. Wilson had been formally charged with multiple violations of military law, his once promising career effectively over. The Iron Guardian prototype remained in storage, its future uncertain. Lieutenant Reynolds had requested and received transfer to the Recovery Battalion, determined to honor his father's memory by ensuring no other tank crew would be abandoned in their hour of need. Colonel Callahan? A voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find General Anderson approaching, accompanied by an unfamiliar civilian in an expensive suit. General, good to see you, Callahan greeted him. I thought you'd returned to Washington. Just briefly, Anderson replied. I've come back with Mr. Harrington from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. He's been reviewing our evaluation findings and has a proposition I think you'll find interesting. Harrington stepped forward, extending his hand. Colonel, your performance during the trials was exceptional, as was your team's. He nodded toward Reed. It demonstrated something we've been suspecting at DARPA for some time, that the future lies not in replacing human operators, but in augmenting their capabilities. Callahan raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. We're initiating a new program, Harrington explained, designated Steel Guardians. The concept is a hybrid recovery system, human operators with enhanced mechanical assistance. The best of both worlds, if you will. And you want our input? Callahan guessed. More than input, Colonel. We want you to lead the program. Anderson smiled slightly at Callahan's surprised expression. Your background in armor operations, your experience with recovery systems, and your demonstrated commitment to putting soldiers' lives first make you uniquely qualified. Callahan hesitated. I'm scheduled to retire in 6 months, General. We know, Harrington acknowledged, but this program needs someone who understands both the technical requirements and the human element. Someone who can ensure we never lose sight of why recovery operations exist to save lives, not just equipment. Reed spoke up. If I may, sir, it sounds like a worthwhile mission. Ensuring the next generation of recovery systems is built on the right principles. Callahan looked around at the massive M88s, at the crews working on them, at the young Lieutenant Reynolds inspecting a winch system under Davis's supervision. These were the guardians of the armored force, the ones who ensured no soldier was left behind in the chaos of battle. I'll need to bring key personnel with me, Callahan said finally. Reed, Davis, Reynolds, people who understand the realities of recovery operations, not just the theory. Already approved, Anderson assured him. And your first assignment will be reviewing the Iron Guardian system, salvaging any viable technologies while redesigning the fundamental approach. The focus will be on enhancing human capabilities, not replacing human judgment. Callahan nodded slowly. Then I accept with one condition. Which is, Harrington asked? That we name the first prototype the Reynolds system, Callahan replied, in honor of a tank commander who trusted that his brothers and sisters in arms would come for him when he needed them most. Anderson smiled. I think that can be arranged, Colonel. As they discussed the details of the new assignment, Callahan felt a weight lifting that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 15 years, he'd lived with survivor's guilt, with the knowledge that he had been pulled from a burning tank while others, like James Reynolds, had not been so fortunate. Now he had the opportunity to ensure that future generations of tank crews would never be abandoned to fate or cold calculation. That the sacred trust between soldiers would be upheld, enhanced by technology rather than replaced by it. Reed seemed to sense his thoughts. Full circle, sir, the sergeant major observed quietly. From being rescued to ensuring others will be rescued. Some debts can never be fully repaid, Tom, Callahan replied, but we can pay them forward. The massive bay doors of the maintenance facility stood open to the desert beyond, the harsh landscape that had tested both man and machine during the trials. In that unforgiving environment, human courage, experience, and commitment had proven their enduring value. Technology would continue to advance. Systems would become more sophisticated. But the core principle that had guided recovery operations since the first tank rolled onto a battlefield would remain unchanged. No one left behind. As the sun began to set over Fort Irwin, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Callahan watched a new crew preparing their M88 for night operations. Young faces, determined expressions, the next generation of Guardians carrying forward a proud tradition. The Iron Guardian had failed its ultimate test, but in that failure lay an important lesson, not about the limitations of technology, but about the enduring power of human courage and commitment. Some burdens couldn't be outsourced to algorithms and remote operators. Some promises had to be kept by human hearts and hands. Steel alone wasn't enough. It needed the human touch to transform metal into something more: a guardian, a protector, a promise kept. As twilight deepened over the desert, Callahan turned to face the future, not retirement as he'd planned, but a new mission ensuring that the lessons learned in blood were never forgotten. That technology served humanity, not the other way around. That no soldier would ever again be abandoned as James Reynolds had been. It was a worthy final chapter to a long career, not an ending, but a new beginning. Steel and honor, machine and human, working together to fulfill the most sacred promise soldiers made to one another. We will come for you. No matter what, no one left behind. 2 months later, Callahan stood in the Pentagon briefing room facing the Defense Appropriations Committee. Behind him, a large screen displayed the preliminary designs for the new hybrid recovery system, officially designated the Reynolds Recovery System. Gentlemen, ladies, he began, what I present today isn't just a new vehicle or a new technology. It's a new philosophy for recovery operations, one that recognizes the irreplaceable value of human judgment while embracing technological advancement. The committee members studied the designs with interest. These were the people who controlled the funding that would make the project a reality or consign it to the Pentagon's vast archive of abandoned concepts. The trials at Fort Irwin demonstrated both the promise and limitations of fully automated recovery systems. Callahan continued. The Iron Guardian failed not because its technology was fundamentally flawed, but because it attempted to remove the most critical component from the equation, the human operator. He advanced the presentation, showing a sophisticated vehicle that resembled an M88, but with significant modifications. The Reynolds system takes a different approach. Instead of replacing human operators, it enhances their capabilities. Advanced sensors extend human perception. Robotic assistance systems multiply human strength. AI support systems provide recommendations but leave final decisions to human judgment. Senator Hammond, the committee chair, leaned forward. In the cost comparison to the Iron Guardian program, initial development costs are comparable, Callahan acknowledged, but long-term projections show significantly lower operational costs and substantially higher mission success rates across all scenarios. What about risk to operators, another committee member asked. The primary selling point of the Iron Guardian was removing humans from danger. With respect, ma'am, that perspective fundamentally misunderstands military service, Callahan replied firmly. Soldiers don't join to avoid risk, they join to manage risk in service to their country and their fellow soldiers. The Reynolds system doesn't eliminate risk, but it does provide operators with enhanced protection and capabilities. He paused, making eye contact with each committee member. More importantly, it preserves the sacred trust between soldiers, the knowledge that if you're in trouble, real human beings who understand the stakes will come for you, not remote operators viewing the situation through cameras miles away. The briefing continued for another hour, covering technical specifications, development timelines, and budget projections. Throughout, Callahan emphasized the hybrid approach: human skill and courage augmented by technology, not replaced by it. As the committee filed out for deliberations, Reed approached from the back of the room where he had been observing. "How do you think it went, sir?" he asked. "Hard to say," Callahan admitted, "but I think they understood the fundamental point. That recovery operations aren't just about extracting expensive equipment, they're about keeping a promise." Reed nodded. "By the way, Lieutenant Reynolds called this morning. He's completed the advanced recovery course, top of his class." Callahan smiled. "I'm not surprised. He has motivation most officers lack." "He mentioned something else," Reed continued. "He found his father's old journals in his mother's attic. There's an entry from the day before he died. It says, 'If the worst happens, I know they'll come for us.' That's what makes this Army different from any other in history. We leave no one behind." Callahan felt a tightness in his throat. He believed that until the end. "And because of what we're doing now," Reed said quietly, "future soldiers will be able to believe it too." As they left the Pentagon, stepping into the bright Washington sunshine, Callahan thought about the long arc of his career, from young tank commander to veteran colonel, from being rescued to ensuring others would be rescued, from survivor's guilt to purposeful action. The Reynolds system might not change the world, but it would save lives. It would keep a promise. And in the final analysis, that was all any soldier could ask for: the certainty that they would never be abandoned, never be forgotten, never be left behind. Steel and honor, technology and humanity, working together to uphold the most sacred trust between soldiers. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.